Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Another killing. Great. Another killing. And just to be very clear, we are in the middle of a trial, George Floyd, where Chauvin put a knee on a man's throat for 9 minutes until that man stopped moving. And even after that man stopped moving, kept his knee on his throat longer. I've been listening to the various elements of the trial, and hopefully we can get somebody on to have a conversation further about the trial as it's coming to the point where the prosecution is almost finished. But what's clear is that Chauvin is being dumped overboard, that they are cutting bait. And on some level, I guess you could say from the standpoint for Floyd himself, great, or let's say for the family of Floyd, I guess you could say great. I don't believe that justice exists. I don't believe there's a such thing as getting justice after that. Chauvin can burn in hell for an eternity, and in no situation will Floyd's mom or family members be made whole in that situation. Punishing the culprit, punishing the person that did it, doesn't bring back justice because there is no way to make that situation whole. You could torture that guy forever. It's never going to bring back the kid. It's never going to make that person feel like something is balanced. There is no balancing of the equation. There's a shot in the darkness to try to get something that's similar to balance, but it's never balanced. And here we have again, while a trial is going on, another killing. I made the point yesterday that this killing, however, is massively insufficient. It feels something is missing in this, meaning as bad as it is for Chauvin to intentionally murder a man, this feels worse in that it doesn't seem to be intentional. It doesn't seem to be that the individual had malice and intent in their heart when they went and did what they did. Oh, this doesn't seem to be that. And because it doesn't seem to be that, on some level, it feels worse. The accidental aspect of it. You have a person who breaks away. And as I watched the video, I said to myself, oh my God, dude, they will murder you. Don't do that. And in short order, she pulls out a weapon. Taser, taser, taser. Shoots point blank range, putting a bullet in him, not a taser. All sorts of questions come up, right? Why were they stopping him? Why were they taking him in? Why were they processing and arresting? All of those things come up. But at the very end of it, what you have is a traffic stop that has gone monstrously wrong. Let's play the clip from the officer having a conversation about what went on last night and the problems associated with it. Let's play the clip.
As I watched the video and listened to the officer's commands, it is my belief that the officer had the intention to deploy their taser, but instead shot Mr. Wright with a single bullet. This appears to me, from what I viewed and the officer's reaction and distress immediately after, that this was an accidental discharge that resulted in the tragic death of Mr. Wright. I have asked the BCA to conduct an independent investigation into the shooting and death. Once they are completed, I expect they will submit their findings, independent of me, to the appropriate authorities, the appropriate attorneys that will look and review this case. I'm also stressing that I do hope for the community to be patient and allow this criminal investigation, to be completed as thoroughly as possible. I believe Mr. Wright deserves this, as do all involved.
Obviously this is deeply tragic.
Let's stop right there for a moment. the voice that you guys were listening to is basically Brooklyn Center Chief Tim Gannon. And I'm not going to show the video because I get tired of watching snuff films. But you can see it for yourself. He goes to a traffic stop. The cops walk up to him. Apparently, they pull him out the car. They're about to process him. In the pursuit of about to process him, he decides to run. Fight or flight. He's not fighting them. I need to stress that. He gets into the car. He tries to take off. The officer is trying to stop him. She screams, taser. Everybody pulls away. She shoots. And then she says, OS. I shot him. The entire video gets across that she didn't mean to shoot him. She didn't mean to put a bullet in him in point blank range. What she meant to do was tase him. That's kind of my point on why I said this feels so insufficient. It's one thing if a person used malice and intent to put a bullet in an individual to take their life. That's one thing. And on some level, as full of anger and resentment that's there, even in that case, that on some level is more satisfying. I think the problem is the non-intent, the accidental nature of it, the way in which a person's life on a whim can be ripped away, not intentionally. Now, you could say that, oh, the cops are making this up. You could say that the cops are lying. All of those things could be possible. I'm just saying from the video that I watched, it really did seem like the woman made a mistake. That said, you're going to have some people who say that Daunte's life is forfeit because he decided to run. Or his life, it's perfectly okay, it's a fair killing because he decided to run. I don't know what job does incompetence allow a pass. If you are a doctor and you're screwing up royally, because my point is there's a basic level of competence that's expected in any job that a person is doing. If I am a surgeon, there is a basic level of competence that I have in doing a task. And if I kill somebody due to incompetence, yes, I could be sued. I'm definitely going to be fired. And whether I be prosecuted or not, it's going to depend on the level of incompetence. The same thing applies to pretty much every other job. If I am writing software, there's a basic level of competence that I'm expected to exude when I'm writing that software. And if I write something and the company gets hacked, the company gets attacked, and the company says on a very basic level, you should have been able to do this, then yeah, I'm going to lose my job and I might get sued for it. This is no different. This woman screwed up royally and a person lost his life as a result. And while it's perfectly legitimate to say, God, he shouldn't have run, and God, that shouldn't have happened, there's also something weird about a society that looks at a situation like that and, oh my God, they're going to murder him, they're going to kill him, because everybody knows cops are maniacs. And in a situation like that, yes, they could very well take his life. And the way that they took his life, by the way, they could have did it intentionally. The reason that people scream, oh my God, don't do that, is because in many circumstances, that is a killing and that's an intentional killing. This, weirdly enough, wasn't. And in a weird way, that makes it worse. Look, I don't know what is going to take place with this, with the woman that was involved in this killing. She should be fired, clearly. And on top of being fired, there should be questions that are asked on whether or not the basic level of competence was exuded here. And if not, what is the consequence for that? From my standpoint, putting this woman in prison for what seems to be a mistake would seem to be just as bad. And I got to be honest, I get that that's a controversial take, especially a controversial take with Floyd being with the case with Chauvin. But I'm stuck with this thing that he ran, she screwed up. She had no intention on killing him, or at the very least, it didn't seem like she had an intention on killing him. In her mind, she was going to tase him. She made a mistake. Does that mistake require jail time if that mistake in no way had any intention of putting him in the ground? And that's what I'm stuck with. Yes, I think she should be fired. Immediately fired. But on top of immediately fired, processes can take place and investigations can take place to figure out whether or not this level of incompetence has criminal negligence. I'm open to all of it. I'm just saying, from my take, looking at this, it seems like she made a mistake, a monstrous mistake that ended up taking somebody's life. I also understand the zero tolerance take that comes from people of the community who are there, who are also watching a trial for Derek Chauvin, and they say, no mas, no more. Shane, what are your thoughts? I am, this is so unsatisfying. On some level, I almost would have preferred intent. Meaning, in a weird way, on some level, I almost would have preferred that cop to just be racist, or that cop to just be vicious and angry, or that cop to just lose it. That's not that. This one was just incompetent. And like I said, for some reason, that just makes it worse. What are your thoughts?
I don't know. I don't see it. In my opinion, it doesn't make it worse. We're at weird crossroads on this one, or weird cross beliefs. I don't think it makes it worse. I don't. In a sort of, again, in a mechanical sense, I remember talking about this stuff with you during the protests last summer. In a mechanical sense, I understand why people are reacting this way, but I don't necessarily think that helps. On the other hand, I don't believe in qualified immunity. I believe that she should be brought up on involuntary manslaughter charges, and if she's convicted of those, she would face some prison time, is my best guess. Not that much of it, around a year, possibly less. But that's how you deal with this sort of thing. You treat police officers as if they were members of the public. If they commit crimes, you charge them with committing those crimes. Otherwise, you get the continuation of those policies. Having said that, this isn't as bad as if a police officer were to intentionally kill a civilian, let alone a black civilian. This is not it's not nearly as bad as that. This is somebody who screwed up royally and killed somebody and shouldn't have done so. People talk about the whole defunding the police thing. I think that was a completely bogus way of framing the issue. But there is something in reapportioning which services police are filling basically what they're supposed to do. And if you're stopping somebody for a traffic violation and you end up shooting them, and if that is a pretty consistent way that people end up getting shot in the states, maybe there should be a only armed with tasers, so this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Because after all, unless it's like a chase where somebody has then actively fleeing the police with police following them. Unless it's security, I don't see the circumstance in which people are routinely going to need to kill the person who's driving the car. Usually a taser is plenty good. They're immobilized at that point. They can't drive away. Anyways, what do you think, though, Jamarl?
I don't strongly disagree. It's subjective. It's just subjective. I mean, when I say it makes it worse, I don't mean as a cosmic, flat, fat God himself said. It's not that. It's just that it's unsatisfying. It's one thing. It's like it's this weird chance element. I get some people are going to be like, "Oh, he shouldn't have resisted." Yeah, great. By the same token, that doesn't mean he should lose his life. And if it's up to incompetence that causes him to lose his life, yeah, she should lose her job, to put it mildly, at the very least. And if there are some kind of processes that come into place that said, yeah, this was negligence to the point where she should be prosecuted, okay, fair enough, I don't hate that. But I do accept that this woman was probably thinking about cookies she was going to bake later that evening. She might have had a kid that she was going to take out somewhere later that night. There's all sorts of things that she probably thought, I got up this day, I didn't have any intention on hurting or injuring anybody. In the pursuit of my job, I screwed up. And I know that pretty much everybody has had some situation where they screwed up that didn't have these monstrous consequences, but screwed up nonetheless. I guess my thing, and like I said, it's subjective, right? I'm not saying this is a hardcore, this is what I full well, this is, exactly what it is. It's just, to me, it feels unsatisfying. That's all. Because all of these things are screwed up, right? Her life is screwed up. His life is forfeit. The family's life is gone. And in no situation was there malice and intent in any of it. That's what I mean. There's nothing that I can sit this on and say, right there, your fault. Yes, I could say there's a system in place where this stuff gets incentivized. Fair enough. I could even say that there's somewhat of a racist justice system that pushes this stuff forward. Again, fair enough. But in this very specific instance, this woman had no intent to take this man's life, or at the very least, it didn't seem to be. And in this very specific instance, it didn't seem like there was this clear want to cause havoc and damage. It seemed the opposite. It looked like she wanted to tase him. So I'll end this here. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. Yeah, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment with Alexander McCurris.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. There is a lot of conflict right now taking place in the UK, or let's say Northern Ireland. Part of this has to do with Brexit and the unreachable dream of Brexit. This idea that you could split away from the European Union while simultaneously keeping Northern Ireland within the orbit of the United Kingdom, despite the fact that the rules are going to be different. There is a border in the Irish Sea. Now, Boris Johnson tried to act like this border wasn't a real border, but indeed, this border is a real border, and some of the people in Northern Ireland are making it very clear that they see it as such. To have a conversation about the chaos that's taking place right now in Northern Ireland and how it's related to Brexit and whether or not that violence and that chaos can be stemmed in any particular way by any sort of negotiation that is going to go forward. We're joined by Alexander McCurris, editor-in-chief at theduran.com. Alexander, thank you for joining us.
Delighted to be with you.
Absolutely. Brexit. Now, we've waited for this. And I don't mean waited in the good sense. I just mean there was always this question about whether or not Northern Ireland was ever going to be reconciled. Meaning, however, was Boris Johnson going to reconcile this notion of a border in the Irish Sea? And this notion that it breaks the Good Friday Agreement wasn't necessarily something that seems to settle all that well, nor was it the Good Friday Agreement even seemed to be thought about when Brexit was pushed through. I remember listening to lectures by people from Ireland basically saying they never thought of what this meant for the Good Friday Agreement, and it didn't even seem like they cared. So 2 points.
Well,
Just 2 points, just so the audience knows. What is the Good Friday Agreement? That's the first point, just as a basic summary. And on top of that, how is Brexit breaking this, and whether or not, and is there a solution to this outside of basically giving Northern Ireland back to the Republic of Ireland? What are your thoughts?
Right. First of all, the Good Friday Agreement is in fact the culmination of a series of agreements which began as a result of negotiations which took place in Northern Ireland to end a conflict, a violent conflict that began in Northern Ireland in the late 1960s, but which has its origins going all the way back to the 1920s, when Ireland itself, what is now the Republic of Ireland, seceded and broke away from the United Kingdom and became an independent state. That left an area of Ireland, the island of Ireland, under British control, which was at that time majority Protestant. It created sectarian division between the Protestant majority, who were loyal to Britain, and the Catholic minority. I'm talking minority within, of course, this region, which wanted union with the Republic of Ireland. That culminated in a war or a conflict in the late 1960s that was settled in the 1990s and early 2000s through a power sharing arrangement where you have a government, an executive in Northern Ireland, which has representatives from both communities. There's also a Council of Ireland, and critically, there was supposed to be an open border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. Now, the point about Brexit is that in the perceptions of some people, it interfered with that open border, because whilst Britain was within the European Union, there was no real border controls between Britain and the Republic of Ireland, because both Britain and the Republic of Ireland were within the European single market and were subject to free movement, the free movement provisions that form part of that single market. When Britain voted to leave the EU, the European Union said that Britain outside the EU could no longer have an open border with the Republic of Ireland. And the EU also said, this I have to say, I do always find a bit surprising, that because this was so, that would in some way violate the Good Friday Agreement. Now, it's important to say that the open border itself is not a term of the Good Friday Agreement. That was something that everybody took for granted at the time when the Good Friday Agreement and the various arrangements that were created around it was set up. But it has become an issue since Brexit. You are absolutely right. Nobody at the time when there was the Brexit vote in Britain voted with the issue of Northern Ireland in mind, and nobody really gave much thought to what would happen to that border once Britain actually did leave the EU. Now, my own personal view is that what needs to happen is that some sort of transitional arrangements need to be made with respect to the border between the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland. That will probably calm the situation in Northern Ireland. I have been to Northern Ireland. I'm familiar with people there. I've spoken to people from both communities. I think everybody accepts, including the government of in London, that the ultimate direction of travel of this conflict is that at some point in the not too distant future, perhaps in 10 years, perhaps in 5 years, but certainly not before very long, Northern Ireland will leave the British Union, the United Kingdom, and will join the Republic of Ireland. So it is part of that process. Things need to be sorted and done along the way, if you like, to smooth that path. But I don't get the sense that anybody in London is going to fight to keep Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom. And I think that it is widely accepted within Northern Ireland that sooner or later, that is what is going to happen. So that will be the ultimate solution to this problem. I think every party to the conflict ultimately recognizes that fact. But in the meantime, because of this issue of the Irish border, there has been problems within the Northern Irish community in Northern Ireland itself, because in order to get his Brexit deal through, Boris Johnson agreed to an open border, to continue the open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And he placed instead a trade barrier along the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Britain, which has created a difference between Northern Ireland and the rest of Britain, which some people amongst the Protestant community in Northern Ireland find unsettling. I don't think this is something that is going to lead to a violent conflict in Northern Ireland. It is a problem which I am confident can be managed effectively, given, as I said, the ultimate direction of travel.
Well, it is already, it's to some extent, I think I understand the distinction that you're making. It is already to some extent certainly a violent conflict, simply because there have been riots going on there for over a week at this point. But I think what you're saying is you're not going to see a resumption of the long-term rebellion, insurgency, long-term terrorism, all of that stuff. Isn't this,
exactly.
It seems to me looking at this from a somewhat naive perspective, that this is all very strange and in its own way kind of ironic, in that the United Kingdom has, by what it's done, Boris Johnson has put the UK in a position where they are giving Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland. That's what you're saying. They've set themselves up effectively where that seems to be the most likely outcome of this. They themselves decided that, which is not something you would have expected them to do. And it leads me to wonder if, you have Ireland fully independent, if Scotland in a referendum at some point soon were to vote for independence, at what point is this just a return to the heptarchy? At what point is this just a return to the sort of pre-United Kingdom where Britain is increasingly divided? Are those active worries in the UK at this point, or is that too far off on the periphery to be something even possible? Where Wales, for instance, with a much less active independence movement than Scotland, is that anywhere on the horizon, or is that effectively impossible right now?
It is very much on the horizon, and the government in London and the authorities in London, which is not the same as the government, the security services, are extremely concerned about it indeed. I will say this. Over the course of 2019, when there was a very bitter battle about whether Brexit would indeed happen at all, despite the referendum that happened in 2016, there were a considerable number of opinion polls which were done in England, which is the only region of the United Kingdom which voted for Brexit, but which counts for around 80% of Britain's population. And what people found, the pollsters found, is that English supporters of Brexit recognised that there was a distinct possibility that the United Kingdom might break up, but were prepared to accept that in order to achieve Brexit. That was how strong feeling about Brexit was at that time, and nothing that has happened since leads me to think that that attitude has changed. Now, that is not the same. That's popular feeling. That is not the same as the feeling of the establishment in London. Now, I think the establishment in London has accepted that Northern Ireland is going to go. I mean, I think Northern Ireland, saying it bluntly, was always an anomaly. Once Ireland itself left, it made little long-term sense to keep this bit of Ireland under British control. That was part of a British imperial strategy, which is long since redundant. And Northern Ireland joining the Republic of Ireland simply completes the Irish independence and unity which was conceded by Britain in the 1920s. But losing Scotland, which accounts for something like 40% of British mainland territory, which will lead to the setting up of an independent government in Edinburgh, sharing the island of Britain with London, which will gain control of the oil wealth and of Scotland's human resources. That is something which the government in London and the authorities in London are exceptionally concerned and worried about. And they're going to do everything within their power to prevent it from happening. Because if it does happen, it will result in a major decline, or so the British
Alexander.
believe.
Absolutely. We need to go into a break, and I want to come back on Ukraine, but I want to ask one sort of quick follow-up question just to try to get a sense from you. 50 years out in the future, several generations from now, what do you think Great Britain, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, the island, what will that look like politically? Where will the lines be drawn in your best guess at this point?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, I think Irish unity is now a virtual certainty. I think Scottish independence is now a strong probability, though not a total certainty. I mean, there is still some pro-British sentiment, in fact, a lot of pro-British sentiment in Scotland. But I'm going to assume that there will be Scottish independence. I'm going to just assume it. I think at that point we will have England, Scotland, and Ireland, and I think that these three countries will nonetheless still work together very closely, and there will be all sorts of arrangements between the three of them, which will preserve a great deal of the common cultural and economic space that has been created over the long period of the British Union. If you go to these three territories, you will find that they have a huge amount in common. They will speak the same language, their economies are interconnected with each other. There's nowadays very little real animus between the three, and I think they will each find their own way and will cooperate very closely with each other. And
culturally, they will be united, but in terms of their politics and their economics, certainly, I'm guessing they're going to be pretty. If Scotland is independent, there are going to be some serious bridges, serious divides between the three countries.
There will be.
Like
there will
saying,
be.
Culturally, they'll have a lot in common.
And politics are very different. I mean, Scotland, for example, is politically speaking very much further to the left than England is on most issues. I mean, its politics are anchored much further to the left than those in England. And that's
okay. Very interesting. We need to go to a break. We are joined by Alexander Mercouris. He is the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You can follow Alexander on YouTube on his channel, Alexander Mercouris. You can also watch The Duran on YouTube, and you should check out their website, theduran.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we'll be back with Alexander in a minute, talking Ukraine, G7, NATO calling for Russia to back down, but we're giving you some of the backdrop here. The context with Ukraine moving their troops eastward first. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be back with Alexander on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about Ukraine and the threat of active war. This comes as within the last day, Ukraine's foreign minister, in a talk with the head of NATO, Secretary General of NATO, basically got Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, to call on Russia to withdraw its troops. This comes as the members of the G7 economic community have also issued a joint declaration asking Russia to withdraw. And it also comes as on Saturday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, in a visit with President Vladimir Zelensky during a meeting, expressed support for Ukraine against Russia, effectively. Now, all of this has been worrying. All of this continues to be worrying. And part of what's so worrying about it to me, Alexander, is the fact that, as we were talking about, as you were on this show to talk about maybe a month and a half ago at this point, a little bit over a month ago, it was Ukraine, as far as I can tell, that first moved its troops eastward. And it was at that point that the artillery shelling, that the line of conflict became more heated and more deadly. This was in the past at this point. And it was only within the last couple of weeks when the news came out that Russia had been moving troops down to the border and repositioning its troops near the border, that the Western press seriously started to speak about this issue. And in a word, we're dropping context. The Western media has given, some elements of the narrative. And of course, the political class, I'm sure, is both fueling this and has readily gone along with them in dropping that context. We're only giving one side of the narrative of events here. And it seems like that has metastasized or maybe even started with the political leadership, not just in the United States, but in NATO and in the sort of Western international community on this issue. Am I wrong here, Alexander?
No.
And for those listening, For those listening, I
You're
just want to give you a heads up. We're joined by Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief at the Duran. But Alexander, what do you think?
You're absolutely right. I mean, we did that program on this channel about the fact that the Ukrainians were deploying their forces to the ceasefire line and were breaking the terms of the ceasefire. I did programs about this on my own channel. If you look at the programs that have appeared on Sputnik, on all kinds of other places, you will find much discussion and debate about the Ukrainian deployments. You would not know about them if you followed the Western media or considered what Western governments were saying. They all suddenly woke up to the fact that there was a deteriorating situation in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, when the Russians undertook their counter deployments of Russian forces to the Ukrainian border in order to deter what looked like a possible Ukrainian attack at that time. Suddenly, that became the big issue, and the whole thing is now being framed as the Russians acting aggressively, ignoring the fact that the Ukrainians actively deployed first. We've even had this grotesque program on CNN where a Ukrainian train with tanks has moving to the Donbass from the west is misrepresented as a Russian Ukraine with a train with tanks moving to the Donbass from the east. I mean, it's a complete distortion of reality. Having said that, I think one also needs to unpack all the various comments and statements that Western powers have been making. Not Turkey, and we will talk about that separately, but they've all been saying it's absolutely terrible what the Russians are doing, daring to deploy their own troops on their own territory in an area close to Ukraine. I mean, that's a bizarre thing to say. But at the same time, they're all making it very clear that they don't want to see a war in eastern Ukraine. They're clearly acutely worried by the possibility of a war, which Ukraine would be certain to lose, and they are stopping short of giving Ukraine assurances either of military support or of NATO membership or of any of those things, which is what Ukraine has been looking for. So I think that behind all the talk of support for Ukraine and unfaltering support for Ukraine and all the rest, we are probably past now the worst point of the crisis. Whatever the Ukrainians had in mind as a result of that big deployment of forces to eastern Ukraine, they themselves now are talking about the need for a ceasefire and a pullback. And there is also talk of a summit meeting being organized between Putin, Zelensky, Merkel, and Macron, which I suspect its purpose will be to try to organize it. So I think we are probably past the worst point of the conflict in real terms. What now remains is the rhetoric and the narrative framing, which for the West now has become almost as important as anything else. It's a very dangerous situation in a way, because when you are constructing a narrative and the desire, the need to control the narrative and to preserve the narrative has become almost as important as everything else, you can lose sight of what's important. But I think in terms of the actual conflict, the danger of a conflict now, at this particular point in time, this summer, I think that is probably not going to happen.
Well, I think my biggest concern about this is the narrative, as you say. I think there's a problem when, from our standpoint, let's say from the standpoint of the Western people and the information we get in the United States, all context is dropped. So from our standpoint, they need to invent reasons for why Russia is moving their troops, because they can't be honest and say, well, Ukraine, some of which are Nazis, are mobilizing and taking provocative action. And I even wonder on whether or not the provocative action on some level is from a blank check by Biden. And yeah, I use the blank check term with all of the historical force associated with it. Because if the Ukraine is talking to Biden and Biden is acting as if the United States is going to back you regardless of what you do, oh, that's horrible. That's horrible. And then you combine that with dropping all context for the American public to know exactly what's going on. Meaning the American public doesn't see Ukraine as being aggressive. Ukraine is flag burning ceremonies. They have Nazis in the various brigades. And they were taking troop actions that Russia responded to. No, the only thing they show is Russia's being aggressive, period. That's it. That's all they talk about. That's dangerous. Absolutely. That's monstrously dangerous.
Absolutely, because of course it doesn't reflect in any way any conceivable reality. It perpetuates the conflict, and it does so in a situation where the real balance of power between Ukraine and Russia, and it's actually tilting ever further in Russia's favor. It's not, I think, being widely understood this. So what you're doing is, what they're trying to do, it seems to me now, is, as I said, I don't think there's there is always a possible risk of a war, but I think it's diminishing now at this particular time. But the way it's all going to be framed is that if there isn't going to be a war, it's not because Ukraine didn't attack, it is because the West's standing by Ukraine somehow deterred Russia. And that's going to become the endlessly repeated version of this affair, to the point where that is going to distort decision making.
Well, Alexander, it's even more ridiculous than that, because what they did, the New York Times. I was reading a thing today, New York Times propaganda, and I thought they were talking about actual propaganda. No, they were talking about a different point of view. No, New York Times the other day ran an article where they were talking about the troop movements and their explanation of it, because they don't want to deal with Ukraine as being aggressive. They don't want to deal with that. Ukraine is being provocative. Maybe Biden gave a blank check. They don't want to deal with that. So what they would say is it's because of Navalny, that Russia is making troop movements in order to wag the dog for Navalny. And it's like, are you serious?
Well, exactly. I mean, that is. Absolutely. I mean, they can't come up with a serious explanation for this, and so, of course, they come up with all sorts of far-fetched ones. If one goes back to the events of 2014, when there was the war in the Donbass, then the explanation was Vladimir Putin's way of trying to divert attention from the protests that had happened in Moscow in 2011. Which brought out all of 20,000 people. I mean, these are fantastic ideas, but unfortunately, what they do is they.
Alexander, we're gonna have to end it here. I apologize, but yeah, it's ludicrous, and the honesty of it, the context of it, that never gets put. The West stood strong against Russian aggression. That's the way that's gonna cut it. The voice that you guys were listening to is Alexander McCurris. He's editor-in-chief at Duran.com. You can follow Alexander on Twitter. On YouTube, on his channel. You can follow Alexander on YouTube on his channel, Alexander McCurris. You can also watch the Duran on YouTube, and you can check out the website, Duran.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines on Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective, a needed context lens at that. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, simply, I suppose, Shane Stranahan.
And that means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas. and Stranahan. So let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 476 new coronavirus deaths and 72,286 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 69,030 cases per day, an increase of 6% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 31,292,100 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and just over 562,000 have died from it. Breaking this morning, the CDC and the FDA in the United States have called for a, quote, pause, unquote, in the administration of the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine while they investigate reports of dangerous blood clots. This comes after 6 women have reportedly developed clots in the days following the vaccinations. They also reportedly have reduced platelet counts. So far, upwards of 6.8 million doses of Johnson & Johnson have been administered to the American public. Yeah, I mean, this is becoming a thing, right? And I don't know if it's something that's just quirky with the mRNA vaccine, or for that matter, I don't even know if it's something where their mind has been attenuated to the blood clot issue because of what's taking place with the AstraZeneca.
Okay. Yes. So what's that? Well, I just, yes, you can tell where I'm going to land on this one, Jamarl. If the audience has been following, they know it too. What is, I've gone over these numbers before. What is the base rate of somebody developing blood clots in a given year? In any given year, what's the likelihood that you're going to get blood clots? It's about 1 in 1,000.
I don't know what the number is, but go for it. I'm sure you're going to tell me.
1 in 1,000. Yeah, it'd be a terrible setup if I did not tell you at the end of it. I'm like, I don't know. I'm asking. It's 1 in 1,000. Now, how many of these vaccines have they administered? 6.8 million, and they're investigating 6 cases. That is a less than 1 in a million chance that if it were a correlation, that's less than 1 in 1 million. The number of people who get the vaccine versus the number of people who develop blood clots. As far as I can tell, none of these people have died so far. So it's just blood clotting, and that's not a good thing. I'm not trying to whitewash that. That's not something that you want to have happen. But still, less than a 1 in a million chance, which, as far as I can tell, is it's actually below the base rate. So there could be a chance that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine lowers your chance for blood clotting. I'm not seriously holding to that because I don't see why it would, but it is lower than the base rate. And yet the FDA, the CDC have decided to pause it. I don't know how else to, when I was talking about this maybe a week ago, and when we first started to go back and forth on this issue, I was saying, I'm worried that this is going to spread to the vaccine. I'm worried just generally it's going to damage people's impressions of the vaccines, when as far as I can tell, there is no there. There's not nearly a sufficient reason to restrict the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine. There's not nearly a sufficient reason to pause the use of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It seems disgusting to me because on the end of this, if you're somebody, I get it. If you're an anti-vaxxer, pretty much anything that slows them down is a good thing in your book. And anything that you see that's even potentially dangerous about them will act as mere confirmation for your current disposition towards them. But on the other hand, if you're on the line, or if you think vaccines are a net positive for society and you think that they should be used to prevent COVID-19, well, then look at this. We're restricting our use of a vaccine. I'm going to point out, too, this also comes coincidentally right at the same time. This is the week where we've had a slowdown in the delivery of Johnson & Johnson vaccines after a facility, I believe based out of Baltimore, accidentally mixed up like some of the components of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and I believe it was the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. They accidentally combined the two, and in the process screwed up like 15 million doses of the J&J shot. So in other words, this was at a weird moment in time that we decided to pause this anyway. This is the week when that slowdown happened because of that mishap. It's just pointing that out, but it's still not a good thing, and I'm sure this just is affecting. Okay, for people who are on the line.
If they did find a correlation,
now it's 2 shots that they think are correlated with it. Oh no, the sky is falling. They're all screwed. That's the thought that a lot of people are having. I'm sure it's like, oh man, this must be the case for everything. Now they're covering it up.
Well, let me ask you this: what if they did find a small correlation between the two? Should they tell?
Yeah, but put it in extremely qualified terms, and I would say that's still not reason. I'll put it like this: if you take Tylenol. If you take a fairly normal drug, if you take, an over-the-counter drug that everybody has access to, some of those drugs seem to be net positive, where, they slightly extend your lifespan, they improve quality health markers, that kind of thing. Others of them are bad. So, for instance, common antihistamines, like if you take them on a regular basis for years, I forget exactly which ones, but basically they dramatically increase your chance of Alzheimer's. And yet they're sold over the counter. People take them without knowing it on a daily basis. That is way worse than a 1 in a million or even a 1 in 250,000 chance of getting blood clots. It has to do with the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, as far as I can tell. We have these weird double standards in our society where we completely overlook, don't care about people taking dangerous drugs on a daily basis because it's convenient for them. Yet when we're asked to, impose an obligation on ourselves, when we're asked to step up by taking something that has an extremely and infinitesimally small, practically, likelihood of actually affecting us, we're scared of it because it's new and because it's being talked about in the media. And
Wait,
that is a
imposing an
state of
obligation.
affairs.
What do you mean? Imposing obligation.
Well,
oh, you mean taking it for a larger societal reason?
Yeah, exactly. They're asking us to take it to be socially responsible.
Wait, those are different.
Not just for personal protection.
Because it sounds like
I know,
you're making,
but I'm bringing that up.
Well, it sounds like you're cutting the argument slightly. Because it's one thing if you say, this is a horrible idea that they're putting this out there. People should be brighter enough to realize that this is a small chance, that the chances of this are very, very tiny, etc. It's slightly different to make the case of saying the person should step up for a societal reason. Those are slightly different takes. Does it make sense?
I know, but I'm not laying this out axiomatically with one lemma following the other, trying to build a case like a logician would. I'm just speaking.
Oh, fair enough,
like a person does normally in society.
When I think about this stuff, I always think of this stuff in terms of argumentation. So, but that's fair.
Logic trees and all that.
Yeah,
no,
but look, I get your point.
I hear you, and those are different cases.
And I do get your point, right? Because I would make the societal argument. I have no issue making that argument of saying, because that's the mask argument, basically. It's I get that you don't like to wear the mask. I get that you don't like the thing on your nose and everything else. And you're going to get the majority of people saying, yes, we're going to wear this because it's in the best interest of the larger, for my own self-interest and everything else. But there are some people who say, I don't want to wear the mask. I don't like it. I don't care if I get sick and everything else. And then the societal argument comes into play. It's dude, what about the rest of society? Don't you at the very least care about not spreading it? When it gets to the whole issue of the vaccine, on some level, it's similar in the argument, but this one gets a little bit more different just because it's more invasive. You're taking something into your body in that case. Then the secondary question becomes, okay, but what is the effect on the individual? And is that effect on the individual really that dramatic? At least based on what we've seen. I think it's a fair point to say that we're all on some level in a lab experiment right now. And maybe the reason they're putting so much emphasis on the small stuff is because they're trying to figure out what are the mechanics of the way this interacts in the body. By the same token, if it's less, meaning if the chances of getting a blood clot is less than the number of people who ended up getting a blood clot, was higher than the number of people who got the blood clot using the vaccine, then yeah, it needs to be qualified significantly. Because you don't want to create that false impression. And the last thing you want to do is be like, hey, AstraZeneca had blood clots. Now let's move to Johnson & Johnson and stop them from doing their drug. That's dicey, man. I mean, I agree with you on this. This is one of those cases where I think I agree with you on. I do think you need to qualify it. I think you need to tell it. So you do need to be honest about it. But by the same time, you need to balance.
You don't do the white lie thing. You don't completely cover it up, because not only is that inherently unethical, but then it breeds this concern that, they're covering up symptoms. You do not do that. You just correctly qualify it. This is extremely unlikely. It's so unlikely that we don't even know if there's a correlation. We're investigating it, but for now, it's so unlikely that you just shouldn't worry about it.
And by the way, and I want to give Shane a shout out here. My memory on this stuff always goes back for God knows how long, and I remember examples in a tune that makes people very uncomfortable. I was waiting for the opportunity for Shane to say something like, well, we shouldn't tell this, or we need to push this away, because my first thing was going to be, what about Fauci, Shane? What about Fauci? And the white lie with the mask. I was waiting. It was like Batman and the rafters. But no, you're being consistent, right? It's like, look, don't lie about it. By the same token, don't overblow it.
Exactly. Because otherwise, then they distrust you. And I mean, that's the self-serving version of it. Is okay. I want them to trust me, therefore I should tell the truth. technically that's the way to do it, but it's also because it's the ethical thing to do. You want to live in a society where people are honest and accurate about things so that you can trust each other. So that it's a good, you can trust what they're saying and what you yourself are thinking as you're sort of, living in a morass of opinions anyway. And much ado about that. It's ridiculous that they're pausing this stuff. It's 6 out of 6 people developing blood clots out of 6.8 million people having received the vaccines. When as far as I can tell, the base rate for people to develop blood clots is higher than they're seeing. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Anyway.
No, I do get it. I get what you're saying. I totally get what you're saying. This gets to the whole thing of reality and the problem with monetized reality. How do you know what's real? I mean, it goes beyond the blood clot thing. I mean, like you said, the moment that you catch your political space or your media in a lie, how do you know going forward that they're telling you the truth? That's the problem with all of these different media outlets. All of these guys have a very specific agenda. And it's one thing if I believe that they were being honest in presenting the agenda and just got it wrong, or they were being honest and it's kind of just a blind spot on their side because it's their take. No, I don't believe that. And I think what you're saying about either the Fauci and the mask thing, either just media in general, you got to be able to believe what's being put out because it's coming outside of you. Like, I'm not directly related to it. So I have to either believe you or I'm going to disbelieve you. But at the end of the day, I'm still stuck with the belief. And I want to know, or at the very least have some kind of idea that you're not lying to me for some kind of political effect or to push me in a direction to have a certain take on things. The Ukraine is a good example. And not to fall back into the Alexander Mercouris thing. I think the issue on the Ukraine is one of the most dangerous places on earth. And part of that has to do with our take on it. We're not giving an honest take. So we would look at it and say, Russia's being aggressive. And nobody looks at it and says, well, why are they doing that? What reason do they have to do that? What rationale do they have to do that? And so the New York Times creates one, Navalny. Navalny is the reason. And it's like, is that really the reason? Or is that the nonsense that is being told here in the wag the dog way that we do our politics? No, it's very aggravating and it's very... Look, the problem is the moment that you can have a media in your country whitewash and only show you one side and show you one side in such a drastic way that you come to the conclusion, oh, those guys are just bad guys in almost a comic book villainous way. You've missed the boat. And unfortunately, on stories like this, I get your point, Shane. And yeah, maybe I'm sliding away from this slightly. But your point is the same. You got to be able to believe that the people are being honest when they're presenting a story. And when they're presenting that, if you don't know if they're being honest, you're stuck with this kind of difficulty of, okay, what is reality? And how do we know what reality is if the people who are supposed to give us that reality is giving it to us in ways that are purely in line with their own self-interest? Yeah, it's problematic on many counts. And that is a departure. But let's keep going. We have 1 or 2 stories that we could pull off. Last night, the protests in Minnesota over the killing of Daunte Wright over a traffic violation continued with tear gas fired a second night. About 40 people were arrested, and the protests came despite the declaration of a curfew. The officer responsible for the shooting of Wright has been identified as Kimberly Potter. She said that she intended to pull her taser and shoot Wright, but ended up shooting the gun instead. The police has pulled Wright over for a traffic violation, but upon finding an outstanding warrant for Wright, attempted to arrest him. He resisted arrest, trying to get into his car to drive away before Potter shot him. The warrant was for a gross misdemeanor, carrying a pistol without a permit. He did not have a firearm in the car. And like I said, this is a devastating killing. Because, again, it's not intentional. I don't believe for a moment that she tried to say, okay, I'm going to pull this out in a sign of a Derek Chauvin way. I honestly do believe she thought she was pulling a taser. And in pulling a taser, ends up pulling a gun. And what I would imagine for any typical human being is a horrifying experience, realizes she shot him. What comes of that, I don't know. Whether cops should be carrying weapons in traffic duties, that's another conversation that should come up. But no, I don't believe she did it on purpose. And that makes it, to me, that much worse. Look, those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Tells
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We are bringing Tara Reid back on. And now, I'm bringing her back on because after a conversation with her, she disclosed something that I thought was rather mind-blowing. Tara Reid wrote an article for RT, and it has to do with a conversation, basically, that AOC had, where she was asked the question on Israel and Palestine. AOC gives a word salad answer to this. Now, someone brings up the point that AOC gave a word salad answer to this, and that person who brought it up on Twitter gets a meeting by agents showing up at his house saying, hey, we heard you had something to say about AOC. Were you threatening AOC's life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Now, as Tara is recounting this, she makes the point that something like this had happened to her. Now, this is where I was like, what do you mean something like this happened to you? Well, basically, Twitter sends her information saying that the FBI or the Department of Justice is subpoenaing your records, and they want us to give you everything. And for us to even tell you that they're doing this, we had to go to court in order to get permission to do this. Now, you must understand how mind-blowing this is. There's basically a case sealed that nobody gives her any information about, and it took Twitter to disclose this. Otherwise, it would still be the secret investigation that's taking place above her head, and we have no idea what this investigation is about. But I tell you this, if it was something that was in her interest, I have a hard time believing that they will be keeping this thing a secret. Joining us to have a conversation on this very worrying, threatening even set of events. And I'm glad you disclosed this to us. I mean, this is somewhat of a big deal, which is why I appreciate you telling me. Tara Reid, she's a writer, poet, actor, former Senate aide, victim advocate, and activist. She's passionate about animal rescue, environmental issues, stopping horse slaughter, and protecting wild horses. Her early years were spent as a professional actor and model, acting in classical theater production, television, commercials, and film. She appeared in Highway to Heaven, Days of Our Lives, Molly Dodd, and Dancer in La Bamba. In 1991, she worked as an intern for Congressman Liam Panetta. After working in the field manager for California congressional campaign, she began working for then U.S. Senator Joseph Biden. She also worked for State Senator Jack O'Connell. Tara has worked her entire life to protect those with no voice by speaking out to the power and continuing to advocate for survivors by writing about her experience of surviving trauma. In 2019, Tara was one of 7 women who came forward regarding Joe Biden's inappropriate behavior. In 2020, she shared her entire history with Joe Biden. Her first book, Left Out, When the Truth Doesn't Fit In, is out now. Tara Reid, that's a long intro, but it's a good one to give some kind of context to who you are and what's going on right now. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it was fun hearing the acting thing as well. But it was Days and Nights of Molly Dodd, not Days of Our Lives. But
okay. Days and Nights of Molly Dodd.
Yeah. It was an old.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was me. That was my own.
Don't worry. I just don't want to get a call going, hey.
No, I'm sorry. I just misread. And sometimes your mind is reading something and you transpose the word and put something in.
It's very cool. I was a total Shakespeare geek in as a young person and a theater geek in high school. That was my world. And then college, and outside. And I did a lot.
Like some of these movies I'm aware of. Days and Nights of Molly Dodd, I'm aware of that one. Highway to Heaven, I remember that one. And La Bamba. That's
La Bamba was awesome. I was a dancer. I was actually just going to be an extra because I wanted to experience a film set, and I got to be an extra on it. And then I auditioned for the dancing and got like a little close up, and yeah, it was cool. New York Times thought I lied about it, and I actually had to find the clip, and it got sent to them.
Well, that brings us to this story on some level. We were having a conversation yesterday, and you mentioned that there was an investigation that you didn't know anything about, that when you called to ask about, they basically gave you the stiff arm. Now, the way you found out about this, in and of itself, was weird. Twitter sends you an email, and they tell you that we had to go to court in order to even get across and to even disclose this to you, because all things being equal, they wanted to keep it a secret that they were pulling your information. Now, the interesting thing, you did send us the subpoena so we could see it and we could verify the subpoena. It's a real subpoena. And it is asking for basically all of the information that they have at their disposal, either as a CD or basically as a digital information. They black out the agent that supposedly is involved in this, even though they do give you the person who the information is going to be sent to. But the catch with this is you called about this when you found out, like anybody else who would be shocked by this. What do you mean there's a case that's over my head and it's a secret? And like any other rational person, you called. Now, when you called, what happened? First, who did you call? And when you called that person, what was the feel of that conversation? And what was the information that they disclosed to you in that conversation?
All right. Well, let me start back. So I, as I had mentioned in your last show, I had threats to kill me when I came out in 2019 and I was called a Russian asset. Immediately, I was threatened. Someone called me in the middle of the night and said they were coming to my house and knew my address, that sort of thing. So, and a couple other things happened. My website was hacked, other things. So I went to the FBI and made an official report, and also to local law enforcement where it was appropriate. And in that process, of course, I came in contact with a particular agent who helped me, and I don't want to say his name on the air because that's not appropriate, but he assisted me with filing the report. I met with him in person and his partners. They did not ask me any questions about the Joe Biden situation, but were aware of all the publicity, obviously, because they started, investigating why I was getting death threats. So this went on, and I didn't really hear anything. I kept getting horrible, threats online. People would say things besides threats on my life. It would be things like, I would get a private message saying, "We're going to post your bankruptcy unless you be quiet." And then my bankruptcy would be posted. "We're going to post your divorce papers unless you shut up about Joe Biden." And then it would happen. So I would send all of those messages on to this particular case. So when I first got the subpoena information from the Twitter attorney, I was wondering, okay, is this the case to protect me or not? And so I went to an attorney and said, "Can you help me with this?" An attorney was already working with me. So she called and talked to the Twitter attorney, and the Twitter attorney was absolutely unable to give any further information other than there was a sealed case, a grand jury's been impaneled, I'm part of this case. They wanted all my Twitter and they took it under sealed search warrants. So Twitter was subpoenaed, I think, 6 times before they finally, they kept getting, requests for my information. So it was 6 times. And then they kept going to court to say they wanted to inform me. I asked if Instagram, Gmail, if all my other social media was also part of this. And the Twitter attorney said, "I am so sorry, I can't answer this question. Different companies have different relationships with their subscribers. What I would say is, if we're getting this, it could be, but I can't say that. I don't know."
Wow.
So basically he was saying, so I left the conversation going, okay, so they're getting all my information. But what was strange to me is if it was a case to help me, why were they doing it under sealed kind of cloak and dagger circumstances when I was cooperating with them about, about this other thing? So it's never been clear to me. It's been going on for a few months. All I know is that there's a grand jury impaneled, that there's a district, that it's a DOJ case with an assistant attorney general working on it, and there's a judge involved. Other than that, I kind of just wait. And I really am upset that there's this intimidation factor happening more and more for people. So that's why I wrote that op-ed about Ryan Wentz. Ryan Wentz was approached by CHP, California Highway Patrol, who doesn't normally even have purview over federal issues. They came to his back fence, yelled his name, started questioning him, accused him of threatening to kill AOC, and you've read the story, and he's been on a couple of shows since describing his thing. And I spoke to him directly. So I wrote this piece because I wanted to say, what is going on? Are we entering a police state? Like, why are, I can understand Capitol rioters if they were doing harm, violence, threats. That's different. If they are, going and pursuing legal channels to address that. But why are they going after, people that are not involved with that kind of activity and private citizens? It's in this way. So I was kind of looking at it as a meta issue, if you will.
Absolutely. And that is something, when we were talking about the Capitol riots, the day after it happened, when we went on the air, we condemned what the people who were rioting, breaching the Capitol, what they were doing. But from the first day on, we were also worried that particularly would be seen as a justification for much wider domestic pushback. And, investigating people, investigating activists, pushing back on journalists, that kind of thing, which had been picking up in recent years, but it definitely seems to have accelerated since then. And Ryan Wentz, if folks haven't seen the video, again, this is AOC talking about Israel and Palestine, and is a shining example, as far as I'm concerned, of circumlocution. She's completely talking around the issue. She's sputtering. She's not giving a direct answer to the question, because she's kind of being put in a weird spot in that question. But Ryan Wentz boasts about it, not threateningly, just jokingly, as a lot of folks were online. And like you're saying, he gets investigated. Now, I want to come back to your story. We've only got a minute left on this side of the break. When did this happen? When were you first notified by Twitter about what was going on here? What's the brief timeline of events, Tara?
At the same time that the Monterey DA was doing sealed search warrants into my education and threatening felony perjury, it was happening at the same time. So in the summer, late summer, fall, right before the election, and then has gone on. I found out about the Twitter thing in December.
There we go. You know what? We've got to close it out here. We'll be back with Tara in a minute. We are joined by Tara Reid, talking about a sealed investigation that she was only notified of by Twitter, by an attorney for Twitter, telling her that they were getting subpoena requests for all of her information, and they had to fight to let her know that they were getting these requests. We're going to be back with Tara on the other side of the short break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Tara in just a minute.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us, or continuing to join us, is Tara Reid. She's a writer, poet, actor, former Senate aide, victim advocate, and activist. She is passionate about animal rescue, environmental issues, stopping horse slaughter, and protecting wild horses. Her early years were spent as a professional actor and model, acting in classical theater productions, television, commercials, and film. She appeared in Highway to Heaven, Days and Nights of Molly Dodd, and as a dancer and La Bamba. In 1991, she worked as an intern for Congressman Leon Panetta. After working as a field manager for California congressional campaign, she began working for then U.S. Senator Joseph Biden. She also worked for State Senator Jack O'Connell. Tara has worked her entire life for protecting those with no voice by speaking out to power and continues to advocate for survivors by writing about her experience surviving trauma. In 2019, Reed was one of 7 women who came forward regarding Joe Biden's inappropriate behavior. In 2020, she shared her entire history with Joe Biden. Her first book, Left Out When the Truth Doesn't Fit In, is out now. And Lord knows that truth did not fit in a Democratic Party that were terrified that anything was going to stop Joe Biden from shuffling into office. And yeah, I think they thought that considering the Clinton emails and everything else, I think they reacted to you as if it was an immune system, like they were killer T cells. And you were something that just didn't compute at all. I mean, honestly, that's the way they seem to have act. And so this gets to this issue, meaning the issue of the case itself that we were talking about in the last segment. How do you see this? I mean, do you see this as retribution? Do you see this as threats? Why do you think that this investigation is taking place? Because for my framing of this, if it was something that was to your benefit, they would tell you. Meaning, if it's somebody who's threatening you, they would say, hey, we were dealing with the case of the person who's threatening you, and this is what we know. Or this is the case of the person who's threatening you, but we can't tell you the secondary information. That's not that. This is, you're bothering us by asking us these questions. And you're not even supposed to know that this was even taking place to even be talking to me in the first place. That's what this looks like. How do you frame this from your take?
Well, I tell you that I had said, when we had talked earlier, I just said all roads lead to Biden. I mean, this is, I came forward about his sexual harassing me when I was a staffer and about the sexual assault. And when I came forward, the pushback was firm and strong at first with the Russian narrative, because we're in that neo-McCarthyism mode right now. And it's all kind of falling in line with us moving towards this Cold War with China and Russia, which is ridiculous. Nobody wants that. But we're going down that road. And so I'm just sort of like political collateral damage. Like they're just kind of sweeping me up in that narrative. Anyone who disagrees with the Democratic elite agenda, you're an outlier. You're must be a Russian asset. I mean, even Tulsi Gabbard, was called that, and just prominent journalists have been called that are like Ryan Grimm, and it's ridiculous. What I will say is that I confronted the FBI officer. I went on the phone. I was like, wait a second. I said, are you investigating me? Tell me right now. And he wouldn't answer the question. FBI has a way of answering a question with a question, if you will. But he wouldn't specify what it was about and said he could not. And, I said, does this have to do with Joe Biden? Is Joe Biden using the Department of Justice and the FBI to go after me? And he said, and he answered that. He said, if I saw misconduct, I would report it. So that's the only answer I got from him. So I don't know. I still don't know if it's hanging over my head. And what really gets me is that survivors coming out against powerful people is hard enough, but then to have something hanging over your head like prison, it's unconscionable.
It is. Well, and okay, so I want to come back. A bunch of threats made against you directly. You were on the other side of the break talking about specifically blackmail threats, where people were saying, if you don't stop, we're going to publish private information of yours, your divorce documents, bankruptcy documents, different things. That is blackmail by any definition that I know. That's somebody trying to extract some action out of you by threatening to disclose information of yours. You also had death threats. Before we joined the show, I'm pretty sure you've talked about this publicly. You had your horse. They were threatening your horse, for gosh sakes.
Yes.
Literally grievous bodily harm on your horse, which is about as terrible as it can get, in my opinion. But you add all that stuff together, just a constant harassment campaign. As far as you know, what has been the result of those threats? I mean, I'm guessing, I know that you reported a lot of these. Have any of those people or cases been investigated? What have you learned about the threats made against you specifically?
Nothing. As far as nothing's really been done, in terms of who was doing it, it was K-Hive accounts, it was Sally Albright, it was the Kranzensteins, very aggressively. Kranzensteins were the ones that were sending things like, this is going to be printed about you unless you do this, and so I don't know who they're working for, because to me, they don't have a personal vendetta against me. It seems like they're doing a job, like they're being paid by someone, but who is that? I did find out, of course, you knew about and we talked about it last time, about the Really America Super PAC for the Democrats, and that they were paying trolls. And one of those trolls went after me, as well as the Cuomo survivors. I don't know if anyone's really looking at social media troll farms and American ones. They were blaming Russia, but these are American trolls and people that are being paid to go after American citizens when they speak up or even talk about a political opinion that differs from the mainstream.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hillary Clinton had spent millions in regards to sending people to say bad things about other people online. And the idea that you have to pay people for it is pretty sad in and of itself. But it is something that happens. I mean, other governments use, Twitter as a militaristic endeavor in order to shape public opinion, et cetera. Same thing with Jeremy Corbyn. If you remember that agency in the British government, I cannot think of the name to save my life. But basically, they were paid by the British government, turned around and were attacking Corbyn, despite the fact being paid by the British government, under this guise of fighting Russian disinformation.
You're talking about the Integrity Initiative.
That's it, Integrity Initiative. Because, of course, Jeremy Corbyn was a Russian agent. I mean, for God's sake. But this is like using social media in a way that shapes almost as a psyop of sorts.
It's weaponizing it.
It's weaponizing social media. That's exactly what it's doing. And then dropping the context as if the only people who are doing it are Russia and China. This is a lot of ludicrous.
It is. I mean, at this point, Vladimir Putin must be surprised and proud at how many Russian agents we have in America.
I know, right? Just
right.
God, King Putin at this point.
I mean, it's ridiculous because last night, if you saw the Katie Halper, she had she had Ryan Wentz on. She had some other people from the, Left Bitches podcast, and they had worked also for Soapbox, and they were all accused of the same thing. So, yeah, it's a narrative that's getting tired, and I think Americans are getting tired of it. I think it's getting old. I think people are like, okay, I don't know if I believe Rachel Maddow anymore, but she's been going on about this for 2 years, and, it's kind of ridiculous.
How do you feel about this going forward? I mean, are you overly concerned? Do you consider this to be a threat? Have you guys been attacked and trying to get more information going forward? Like, what's the play? What's the play?
I've been afraid to talk about it publicly until recently, and I just decided, you know what? When I saw Ryan Wentz, when I saw what happened to him, I decided to write the op-ed and talk about it. And I've been very nervous. I mean, like, I've even woken up in the middle of the night and going, I wonder if they're coming for me. It's irrational, but it's this feeling like because I came forward about Joe Biden, now I have a target on my back. And I don't like the feeling, and I also reject it. So there's this part of me that really wants to advocate for everyone who has survived trauma and say, no, you don't have to live like that. We are going to change this. We are going to change rape culture in America. We're going to change the way we look at this. And so I've kind of taken a proactive stance. I'm not easily intimidated, and I'm not easily scared. I see a lot of the things that Joe Biden's campaign did with me as tactics. And remember, I worked for Democrats. I already know the playbook. I know what they're doing. So, it's not working on me as well. Emotionally, of course, it has an effect. It causes anxiety and all those feelings. But then when I look at it rationally, I'm telling the truth. I'm standing my truth. I just keep doing that. And I want to make it easier for the person behind me. And I hope Lindsey Boylan had an easier time of it than I did. Because I really, kept talking about, like, when she started getting trolled, I posted those trolls on social media and said, these are the same ones that followed me and that did things to me and that harassed me. This has to stop. And I think that's what you do. You shine light on it. You shine light on the bullies and you say, no, we're not going to accept this. And you move forward that way.
I think in the case of Lindsey Boylan, you're right. I think that because she was one of the people who started it, but because with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, again, Lindsey Boylan making allegations that he had sexually harassed her and assaulted her at different points. She was one of a wave of people. This is coming out on the tails of the story that Cuomo had his administration suppress results, where again a Democratic aide an aide of his in a private meeting with Democratic lawmakers basically said that they froze. That is the quote, the word, we froze in response to fears of scrutiny from the DOJ on his administration in New York artificially lowering numbers of COVID patients who had died after being sent back, to hospitals from nursing homes, and then in some cases being sent back to the nursing homes before they'd fully recovered from COVID. So that happened. At the same time, you have this wave coming out of people, whether it's literal manhandling, and physical abuse and assault, or sort of political heavy-handed behavior. I think in his case, he gets a lot less protection because of this wave of scrutiny than Biden still has in the media. And part of that might just be because he's president. Part of it's probably that he's been a major power in the Democratic Party for a long time and kind of sidestepped into the presidency after it not seeming clear that he'd even be running at a certain point during the primaries. Anyway, we've only got a minute or two left here. Thank you again for bringing this all out. I want to go back to your case. Where do you see yourself going here? And I don't just mean, you've recently published a book specifically with this case and specifically with the sort of degree of activism that you're getting into and trying to advocate for other people who are coming out. I've just, again, in a broad sense, what's your orientation right now and where do you see yourself going? Tara.
I want to remain a progressive independent. I'm not part of the Democratic Party by any means anymore, or the Republican Party. What I want to do is help with legislation and statute of limitations for rape cases, for sexual assault cases. I want to be active in getting rid of that slush fund that they used in Congress as taxpayer money to pay off people to be quiet about sexual harassment and sexual assault charges. I'm going to be part of legislation that really makes change in that sense. So I want to be an activist there. I also want to continue to write and continue to use my voice. As far as this other DOJ case that we were talking about earlier, I'm just going on with my life and hopefully, nothing bad will happen. And, I can find out more information through attorneys eventually. In the meantime, I just want to keep doing the work of helping survivors find their voice and speak up. And I will continue to, I'm very anti-imperialist. I am very supportive of people that are for peace. And, yesterday was 2 years since they jailed Julian Assange. And we need to talk about what's happening to the silencing of media in general and what's happening to journalists and how they're being persecuted like Julian Assange has been.
Absolutely. 100% agreed with you on that. We have a lot in common there. Tara, thank you again for joining us. Great conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, for those listening, that was the voice of Tara Reid. She's a writer, poet, actor, former Senate aide, victim advocate, and activist. And she has recently released a book that you can go check out now. Her first book, Left Out When the Truth Doesn't Fit In. Go check that out. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute on the other side of the short break.
No, Kyla.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're in a somewhat open segment. We're going to be having a conversation, but if you want to call in, you can. 202-521-1320 is the number. And again, a quick heads up. We always have our almost always have our 9:45 segment at the end of the show. That's the wrap, open for calls. And we will often have this segment open too. And again, the phone number, 202-521-1320. But Jamarl, I know you wanted to head somewhere. Where'd you want to go with this one?
I was just going to go to the Peruvian elections. We were trying to have a guest on to speak about the Peruvian elections. 8:45 is our segment where we basically, like you say, it's either an open segment or we bring people on to talk about various stories that are short and contained. But Peru is having an election. Now, the reason why I've been putting so much focus on what's been taking place in South America is because what's been taking place in South America will have larger implications in regards to foreign policy going forward of the states. Meaning you had a pink tide at one point in South America where many of the left-wing governments joined together in order to create this, I don't know what you want to call it, this kind of economic space, this populist space that was focused on public and focused on public advancement and sovereignty. And that broke down. You had Lula being put in prison, Rosa being taken out of office in the coup. You had a U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia, despite the fact that they won the election by like 10 points. Maduro is under constant pressure with the United States pretending as if somebody else was in charge of that country in one of the weirdest aspects of foreign policy that I've ever seen. Imagine Mexico just saying, you know what? We believe Nancy Pelosi is president because a lot of people didn't particularly like Donald Trump. And so from here on out, we're just going to call Pelosi president. No, she didn't win a pie shop contest, but we're just going to do that anyway, just because we're Mexico and we have, the right to dictate that. It would be ludicrous. And yet that's what the U.S. did. This weird belief that we have the right to dictate who is in charge of another country. Bizarre. And yet, that great old America perspective, nobody sees it as weird at all. Even Mexico with AMLO taking over. My thing is, and my point is, the reason why I focus on this is Lula is out of prison. Lula will most likely be running against Bolsonaro. Knock on wood, fingers crossed. You have the situation where Ecuador, I believe the right-wing president won in Ecuador, but the president that's taking place right here in Peru, well, that guy's a lefty. That guy's going to be running against a right-winger in what is probably going to be another contentious match. But my point is you have the potential for what looks like a forming of a sort of pink tide, especially if Lula takes Brazil, or the Workers' Party ends up taking Brazil. Mas continues to hold Bolivia. And if Peru goes to the left-wing candidate, you're getting somewhat of another pink tide reforming. And if that reforms, you're going to get a coalition of these states. No, not a united South America in the absolute sense, but definitely something that can be mechanically going in that direction in order to compete with, let's say, the United States, or for that point, the European Union. Shane, what do you think about this? I mean, basically, in my head, you had people like Correa who gave sovereignty to, or who gave safety to Julian Assange and in the embassy of Ecuador. And many of these states, when you're looking at what they're doing, for example, the Bolivia thing, lithium being one of the big products in Bolivia. Well, dealing with the Chinese firm and allowing Bolivia to reap the benefits of it was something that he was willing to do. That was something that the right-wing U.S.-backed coup government was not. And so when you think about this notion of a pink tide, it's a big deal from the standpoint of resources from other countries, but it's also a big deal from the standpoint of the well-being of the various people in these countries. And just to give a quick blurb, the Peruvian elections are taking place. They're going to a runoff. Pedro Castillo, he's a far-right union activist and a teacher. Far left. They call him far left. Put that in quotes. And a union teacher. And he is most likely going to be in a runoff with Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of the jailed former authoritarian leader Alberto Fujimori. We're going to bring people on to have a conversation about this a little bit later in more detail. But Shane, what are your thoughts about this notion of a new formation of a pink tide and what that potentially will mean for South America? That seems like a big deal.
It seems better than the status quo. I don't know if it's perfect, but frankly, it's not for me to say. I mean, having more regional blocks, on the one hand, makes more sense than having hemispheric blocks, than having these two massive power centers, which of course was the story, the whole narrative with the Cold War. And it appears to be we see some signs of a resumption of that with a potential alliance between Russia and China deepening, and the United States and NATO being on the other side of that. So having more regional power centers seems a little bit more stable to me. You have more legs under the table, if that makes sense. And if you only have two, there's this conversation of a balance of powers and the relative peace of the 19th century and what led to that. There are different sides of that conversation to have. On the other hand, concerns about wars, concerns about outright competition and warring potentially between the United States, which would not want to give up its supremacy regarding the nations to its south. That's the general conversation. But yeah, to come back to the specifics here, we're talking about the results of the Peruvian election, which had its first round of voting completed yesterday. And as votes are coming in, it seems like the figure in the lead is a relatively unknown, widely unexpected lead figure, Pedro Castillo, who took in something like 18% of the vote, beating out Keiko Fujimori, the sort of presumptive candidate, the presumptive conservative candidate, who only took in about 13% of the vote. I am seeing this being cast in Peru as a competition, a contest between the capital and the more outlying regions, and between the more conservative, economically developed center of the country and the poorer regions, which overwhelmingly seem to be voting in favor of Pedro Castillo. And of course, we'll see in the next rounds of this election how that all plays out. But yeah, if Peru suddenly has a left-leaning figure, we'll see about it. Ecuador, obviously, election ongoing there. Yeah. Bolivia has the left-leaning figure. Venezuela, of course, also, it goes without saying practically. Cuba in the Caribbean. Yeah. If Lula comes into power in Brazil, with Bolsonaro having rampant problems in his government.
Power block.
What is it? Over about a dozen officials resigning over the past few weeks over his handling of COVID, and crazy high death tolls. Peru also has high death tolls, by the way. Peru also, I think, 55,000 deaths right now, and 3 times that rate in terms of the excess number of people who've died. So plenty of deaths that would seem to be caused by COVID-19 that just haven't been properly accounted for.
To put it in perspective, this is the 5th president in 5 years. That's what the New York Times is saying.
Crazy.
It's like this is Peru election for the 5th president in 5 years goes to a runoff. So yeah, chaos.
Yeah. And Keiko Fujimori, the conservative candidate, former first lady, wife of Alberto Fujimori, who again, like you said, she is also facing her own corruption charges. His administration was scandal-ridden by the time it had ended. So she has problems going up in this election. But that's where I would take it. Where are you going to go, Jamarl?
Yeah, no, you're perfectly fine. I was more so just pointing to this election, and more so pointing to the South, and just kind of making this point about, in the same way that the European Union creates a bloc of nations because they believe that their lot is better as a collective, we understand that, though, that we are better off when they are united. When they're divided. And so this kind of, we would prefer to engage with these guys as individuals, as opposed to dealing with them as a collective where they can somewhat defend themselves. But no, I just thought this was interesting, and I would have loved to have somebody on to talk about it. Slightly annoyed by that, but keep it moving.
I hear you. And one of the things, in our relationship with the EU, I think the nations to our south have a lot more reason to resent us and seek independence from us than the European Union does. Yes. After all, after World War II, we did the Marshall Plan. We're much more closely aligned. Heck, most of the colonizers in the United States, most of the colonists, obviously Europeans. There's even like the long-term sort of lineal relationship there that can tie unions around the world together. On the other hand, if you're looking at a pink tide and potential South American unification or South and Central and Caribbean American unification, that would be a huge deal.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's quite that wide yet, and we're still a long way from seeing something like that happen. With the EU, but for some reason my mind is still on birth control, and you know what I'm talking about. Blood clots and birth control.
Go for it. Tell people what you're thinking. Well, tell people what you're thinking about. Because this is somewhat remote, and I think we're going to get somebody in. And this was my fault. My mind got so wrapped up into the previous topic, and what we were going to talk about that it just kind of went with it.
And it's worth talking about. Talking about. It's for one thing, it's a news item. One last quick thing on the EU. Something I've been reading about it's just interesting is the extent to which the United States, with NATO in the EU, has effectively worked to split up the militaries of the different members of the European Union. So different countries are sort of specializing in different components of what would be put together a relatively significant military force. In other words, they're sort of specializing themselves so that prospect of outright war between any individual country goes down, which means that they all need to be dependent on each other. And, strategically, I can see from our perspective that makes sense, but it also seems like it would make them intensely fragile.
That's what I was about to say. That is so weak.
If were to break down and they weren't able to work together.
Yeah, that's massively weak. I mean, because what that means is their military is only set up to fight an external army of somebody else. If that makes sense. Like, for example, if they're set up from the standpoint of NATO in order to attack Russia, then all of them are working in one larger component of a piece. But if they're dealing with anything other than that, or if one of those parts leave, it makes them very brittle. That's very strange that they would accept that.
It is. And France seems to be the one, sort of the most notable exception to this. They seem to be the country which is leaning most towards a generalized military, but I'm not an expert on this stuff. I'd love to talk to somebody about it. Coming back to birth control, we were talking about Johnson & Johnson. This is breaking in this morning. The Johnson & Johnson shot has been paused. Its use has been paused by the FDA and the CDC here in the United States. Out of 6.8 million doses, the current count is 6 women specifically have developed blood clots after taking the vaccine. Now, this is a weird mirror of what's going on over in the European Union and outside of the EU. Australia, for instance, joined the list of countries restricting the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine, where, again, tens of millions of doses had been administered. And then looking at the roundups, looking at symptoms that people had gotten after taking the vaccine, they restricted its use to people over certain age ranges. A lot of different countries did. Basically, approximately 1 in several 100,000 chance that if you take the vaccine, it seems you're going to develop blood clots. Now, in my opinion, that's not significantly high compared to the base rate of people who develop it. I don't want to get too wonky here, but basically, it doesn't seem to me that there is nearly a strong enough correlation between taking the vaccine and getting blood clots that they should be restricting its use. Anyway, I've been giving out different examples of like, okay, if you're an American driver, you have an approximately 1 in 5,000 chance of dying in a car crash every year just based on driving. That's like 50 times higher chance that you're going to die in a car crash as an American than taking the vaccine and getting a blood clot. One other thing, and again, approximately a 1 in 1,000 chance just by default of developing blood clots every year. Any American, it leans towards people who are older, and it leans towards men more than women. Another thing that I hadn't been aware of that I was looking into this morning, birth control, hormonal birth control specifically, whether you're taking a pill or whether you're putting on a patch, it seems to increase your likelihood of developing blood clots by like 3 or 4 times. And yet birth control, the use of it is rampant. Now, I personally, and a lot of the women that I've been with, prefer to use IUDs, to use the sort of implant thing, which doesn't have those risks and doesn't, affect your hormones in a deep way. But we overlook these things. That, whether it's different types of pharmaceuticals or birth control for that matter, that make you way more likely to develop blood clots than a vaccine. And I'm worried about the collateral damage on people's opinions of the vaccine in general. It seems like overreaction from public health officials and politicians and the media across the board. And it doesn't do anybody any good. I don't think we should lie about it. Anyway, we've got to close out here, but any quick take on that, Jamarl?
No, I don't think we should lie about it. I mean, maybe the way to handle it is to get a doctor on to talk about it. Because maybe we're missing something in our understanding of these chances and odds and everything else. And I know from my own experiences that let's get somebody on.
That sounds good. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. You know what? We've got to close this one out. We will be back in a minute with the last hour of today's show and headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition and the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show across these divided states and the increasingly fragmented surface of our globe, covering news, politics, events, and more. In the Independent Corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, I hope everybody's morning has gone well so far and continues to go well. To give a brief roundup of today's show, at 7:30 a.m. Eastern this morning, we spoke with Alexander Mercouris, first about Northern Ireland, potentially, and he said probably, likely, joining up with the Republic of Ireland, seeing an end to that division on that island, and a reduction, significant one, I would say, in the size of the UK. At the same time, we were talking about Scottish independence, what that would look like, that whole conversation. We moved at about 7:45 to talk about Ukraine and Western propaganda, Western dropping of context in the media and by politicians and leaders of states and foreign ministers of states around the world. As months ago, over a month ago at this point, the Ukrainian government moved its troops eastward to the line of conflict with the in the Donbass with the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, and in effect with Russia. Russia has reciprocated, has responded by moving its troops down to the border, but later, and yet when we're talking about this story, not us, when the Western media is talking about this story, they tend to leave the first part out. They only talk about how Russia is moving its troops down, making it look like a Russian act of aggression, leaving out, of course, that Russia was responding to what Ukraine had done. Anyway, that was at 7:30 and 7:45 this morning with Alexander Mercouris. In this last hour, we spoke with Tara Reid for half an hour, starting at 8:15, going to about 8:45, talking about how she had a longer story, but basically it appears that there is some investigation involving her, launched by the U.S. federal government under the Trump administration, but continuing, it seems, into the Biden administration. She only found out about this when Twitter got in touch with her and basically sent her a subpoena request for her records that they had received. They had to fight in court to be able to send her that request. They had to go to court multiple times just in order to notify her that the U.S. government was trying to get access to this stuff, which, in my opinion, good for Twitter for actually doing that. In the interview, she talks about how she doesn't know, she has no idea whether or not the other tech companies, whether we're talking about Google or Facebook, whatnot, whether they simultaneously got subpoenaed to submit her info. The lawyer for Twitter wouldn't tell her about that. My guess, and of course this is just a guess, is yes, but it seems like Twitter was the only one to actually fight to let her know, either successfully or at all. But that was at 8:15 to 8:45. Great conversation. We also talked about Ryan Wentz, AOC, Democratic Party politics, the media in general, where she's going, her career, just interesting conversation with Tara Reid. In this hour at 9:15, we're going to be speaking with Carmine Sabia about the Derek Chauvin trial and the Daunte Wright shooting, as well as immigration and the new security deal signed in talks, at least, in a stage of confirmation between the U.S. government, Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. But without further ado, let's get into the headlines. First up, in COVID news, at least 476 new coronavirus deaths and 72,286 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 69,030 cases per day. That's an increase of 6% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 31,292,100 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus. Just over 562,000 have died with it. Breaking this morning, the CDC and the FDA in the United States have called for a pause in the administration of the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine while they investigate reports of potentially dangerous blood clots. This comes after 6 women have reportedly developed clots in the days following their vaccinations with the J&J shot. They also reportedly had reduced platelet counts. So far, upwards of 6.8 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine have been administered to the American public. Now, Jamarl and I just had a conversation about this. I don't need to get right back into an encore. The one other fact I want to throw in here is that this is also happening in the same week as there was a slowdown in the delivery of Johnson & Johnson shots after a Baltimore facility that creates vaccines basically mixed up the doses from a Johnson & Johnson shot and another shot. I believe it was the Pfizer-BioNTech one. And in the process, spoiled like 15 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson shot. So there was already going to be a slowdown. It's just interesting to me to note that they're pausing it at that same time. It could be convenience, if nothing else, but that's a little bit of a conspiracy. And I just want to make it clear that is one possibility. And I don't even believe that's the case.
And real quick, just to interrupt for 1 second. Just keep in mind, if they're pausing it, I don't think they would pause this for no reason. Look, whether it's the 6, we have heard people complaining, saying that there were issues associated with the vaccine. And we've heard this for a while now. And those people have been called conspiracy theorists and everything else. And now it's, okay, we're going to pause it. And the same thing with the AstraZeneca thing. I guess my thing is it something we just don't know and not seeing in regards to what's taking place that goes beyond just the 6? That would be my question.
Now, that's the conspiracy. Now, if that's the case, isn't that way the heck more controversial? They're lying. If that's the case, go with that for a second. They would be lying to the American public and giving a false pretense for cutting back on the delivery and administration of a vaccine. They'd be lying about it.
They would be lying about it
at that point. That would be a black lie.
Well, they would be partially lying about it. It depends. If they saw, because think about it for a moment. If they said, we think there's a blood clot issue, okay, fair enough. They may actually see that, because from their standpoint, when they're looking at side effects, they take down everything. Doesn't matter how rare or weird it is, they take down everything. And say for the moment, though, they found that it might be, okay, there's something weird, there's something anomalous here. But we don't want to say that there's something anomalous here because we want to bring the vaccine back. It's not necessarily a lie for them to say, okay, we found a blood clot issue. If indeed there might be something there for blood clots, but let's say it just goes beyond the blood clot thing and they don't want to say that. It's a lie, but it's not a blunt lie, if that makes sense. Or at the very least, it's like a political lie. But either way, I guess my thing is it possible that there is something to it that we just aren't seeing? That's why I keep saying, let's just bring somebody on. Because it seems, because I agree with you, if the only thing that they're talking about is these six blood clots.
Cases of blood clots.
Right, then that's mind-blowing that they're going to, then you're right. Then they should have this given in a way that's in perspective. But if
I wouldn't put it past them.
But see, that's just it, though. That's just so extreme. That just seems such an extreme thing to say, okay, for 6, we're going to stop. We've had 6 million doses, and for 6, we're going to stop. That just seems so extreme. So
I hear you. I wouldn't put it past them, but I think it is disgusting. If either way, I'll put it like this.
Yeah, both of those are bad.
Whether it's the blood clots or whether they're lying about it and using the blood clots as a pretense, in either case, it's a bad news. I'll put it like that. But we've gone over this in the morning. We've got more headlines I want to get to. In national political news, last night the protests in Minnesota over the killing of Daunte Wright over a traffic violation continued. Those protests continued with tear gas fired for a second night in a row. About 40 people were arrested, and the protests came despite the declaration of a curfew in the city. The officer responsible for the shooting of Wright has been identified as Kimberly Potter. She has said she intended to pull out a taser to shoot Wright, but ended up shooting a gun instead. The police had pulled Wright over for a traffic violation, but upon finding an outstanding warrant for Wright, attempted to arrest him. He resisted arrest, trying to get into his car to drive away before Potter shot him. The warrant was for a gross misdemeanor, by the way, for carrying a pistol without a permit. He did not have a firearm in the car. And again, this goes on in the city of Minneapolis, specifically, oh gosh, why am I spacing on it right now? The name of the suburb where this stuff is happening.
Oh, Minneapolis
Center. No, I know, but I know it's Minneapolis, but I'm forgetting the name of it. It's a mishap on my part. Anyway, what's up?
Well, the Hennepin County, is that what you mean? Like this?
Brooklyn Center, that's what it is.
Oh, Brooklyn Center. You mean that one. I'm sorry, for the right one. I'm sorry.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, no, it's a suburb of Minneapolis, effectively. And of course, this goes on as in Minneapolis. The trial of Derek Chauvin has just started its 3rd week yesterday and is ongoing. Trial of Derek Chauvin on murder and manslaughter charges for the killing of George Floyd last summer, which sparked last summer's Black Lives Matter protests, and which we're seeing a small resumption of after this shooting. And the question is, how big of a resumption will we see when the verdict comes out on the Chauvin case? We'll see. In other news, the United States government has said it has reached a border security agreement with Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala. According to that deal, the Mexican government will maintain a force of 10,000 troops, with the Guatemalan government sending 1,500 troops to its southern border, where it will set up 10 checkpoints and the Honduran government sending 7,000 troops to its border to, quote, disperse a large contingent of migrants, end quote, that are reportedly situated there. White House spokesperson Jen Psaki said that, quote, the objective is to make it more difficult to make the journey and make crossing the borders more difficult, end quote. U.S. Customs and Border Protection apprehended upwards of 172,000 people attempting to cross the U.S.-Mexico border in March, an over 70% increase from February. In related news, Biden is set to nominate longtime Trump critic Chris Magnus to head Customs and Border Protection, CBP. Magnus is a police chief in Tucson, Arizona. If confirmed, he will head the country's largest federal law enforcement agency, covering 7,000 miles of border, 95,000 miles of shoreline, and over 300 ports of entry. President Biden hosted a meeting of 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans yesterday to talk about his infrastructure bill. Biden is pushing for bipartisanship, reportedly, with Republicans pushing back on the definition of infrastructure and the price tag for that bill, also corporate tax hikes, but not ruling out some compromise. However, Senator Wicker of Mississippi said that, quote, it would be an almost impossible sell from the president to come to a bipartisan agreement, end quote, on increasing the corporate tax rate from its reduction in 2017 under Trump. McConnell has described the bill as a, quote, motley assortment of the left's priciest priorities, end quote, which is, you know, a quip. That's a soundbite, but I'm not sure how true it is. I'm not sure this is representative of what you or a lot of other progressives want, Jamarl. We've kind of gone back and forth on this before. But I'll let you speak for yourself. What do you think about it?
You mean the infrastructure bill?
Yes.
I don't think, look, to me, a lot of this stuff becomes inadequate. And if Democrats are going to get to the point where they're basically negotiating themselves down, then, yeah, I'm not going to be happy with it. And I think a lot of lefties aren't going to be happy with it. Keep in mind, we've just had 560,000 Americans drop dead in a year. So whatever we're talking about, meaning whatever the money that's being spent, whatever we're talking about in regards to the plan that these guys are going to put forth, keep in mind, it's within the context of nearly 30 million Americans that got ill and nearly 600 or 560,000 Americans that dropped dead. And those Americans, poor, people of color, primarily. So if we are going to talk about some kind of structural infrastructure change, it should be something that tangibly deals with these things. I mean, Joe Biden is, let's be honest, he's talking about upping the tax rate to less than what it was prior. So it's like, yeah, Donald Trump might have made it that much lower, but the 29% is less than what Obama had, if I'm not mistaken. I think initially it was like 35%, then Donald Trump took it down to like 20-something, and Joe Biden's just taking the 29. So it's not like he's even doing some kind of mind-blowing thing. And even within the context of a not mind-blowing thing, they're negotiating that down. Again, 560,000 Americans have been torched as malfeasance of this government. And if we're talking about restructuring the society, restructuring the economy, and all of these big FDR-like changes, that's not this. Just to be clear, that's not this. And they're even going to negotiate it down further. And you can't even get them to make a real tax rate. FDR had the tax rate at like 99% or something over a certain amount? And we're quibbling over 29%?
Well, I hear you, but that was also, I mean, again, that was the Great Depression. Now, granted, we're just coming out of a pandemic, and mostly I'm interrupting because I want to get at least 2 more headlines in.
I'm just saying this was worse than the Great Depression.
I don't know about that. I think
you don't think that 560,000 Americans dropping dead in the course of a year was worse than the Great Depression?
Think of the bankers, Jamarl. Are bankers throwing themselves out of windows in depression because Wall Street crashed? Just consider the bankers for a moment. In international news, let's go to this. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg called on Russia to withdraw its troops, and the members of the G7 have issued a joint declaration asking Russia to withdraw. This following the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba asking NATO to act now to prevent Russia from building up troops on the border with Ukraine. Over 13 days, Ukraine's foreign minister has had calls with the foreign ministers of, and this is a long list, but I'm going to go through it, Great Britain, the United States, Germany, France, Greece, Georgia, Denmark, Estonia, Canada, Latvia, Moldova, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Sweden, EU High Representative, and the OSCE Secretary General. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, meanwhile, expressed support for Ukraine during a meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Saturday. And again, we were talking about this with Alexander Mercouris at about 7:45 this morning, how over a month ago we were talking on this show about how Ukraine was moving its troops eastward, deploying troops to the line of contact in the Donbass. Russia has now reciprocated, and yet when we cover that in the Western press, they tend to leave that out. They tend to leave out the fact that Russia is responding to movements, troop movements by Ukraine. Anyway, one more headline here. The Japanese government has reached a plan to release into the sea huge amounts of contaminated water used for cooling the Fukushima nuclear plant following the disaster there a decade ago. Dumping of the approximately 1.37 million tons of contaminated water set to be filling the storage tanks will begin in 2 years and is set to take approximately 30 years to finish. This move is deeply opposed by local fishermen, Japanese citizens living along the coast, and the neighboring countries of China and South Korea. The government has said it will support local fisheries, and TEPCO, that's the Tokyo Electric Power Company, has said it will compensate for damages if they occur. Other than tritium, which cannot be removed but is reportedly safe in small amounts, the other radionuclides will be diluted with seawater to the point that the Japanese government says they're safe to release. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a minute on the other side of this short break with our next guest, Carmine Sabia, talking about the Derek Chauvin trial and the shooting of Daunte Wright, as well as immigration, Biden, and this new security deal between the U.S., Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be back with Carmine in just a minute.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Well,
and we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking the Derek Chauvin trial and the shooting of Daunte Wright. We are joined by Carmine Sabia. He is a writer and editor at large at SabiaReport.com, and you can follow him, by the way, on Twitter at Carmine Sabia. You can watch the Carmine Sabia show by going to SabiaReport.com, and you can subscribe to his feed on rockfin.com/Sabia Report. Carmine, thank you for joining us, especially on relatively short notice this morning. How are you doing?
For you.
Good. Didn't hear the first part of your response, but I'm guessing you're good. I'm hoping so, at least.
Great.
That's good. That's good to hear. All right, let's get into it, man. We are talking, again, the Derek Chauvin trial, which has started its third week this week, as prosecutors are close to finishing their arguments. And we're also talking the shooting of Daunte Wright 2 days ago at this point, over a traffic violation where cops pulled Daunte Wright over, 20-year-old young black man, in a traffic violation. They found that he had a warrant for his arrest. He resisted their attempt to arrest him, getting back into his car and trying to drive away. And then it came out recently that the officer responsible, Kimberly Potter, 25-year veteran apparently, on the force, thought she had her taser pulled and instead shot him with a live firearm. The car drove a couple of blocks. He died shortly after, and a female passenger in the car, was just injured slightly, but not critically. Anyway, that's the brief summary of events. After that happened, this was in Brooklyn Center, a suburb of Minneapolis. After that happened, protesters pretty much immediately took, within a couple of hours, to the streets, specifically congregating on the Brooklyn Center Police Department. There was active protesting, I'll put it like that, with like garbage, rubbish, bottles, and rocks being thrown at cops, and cops deploying tear gas. That continued for the second night in a row last night, with police deploying more tear gas. Approximately 40 people arrested was the last count that I saw. And I'm guessing that it will continue for a third night. Who knows for how long exactly. And this is all as the Derek Chauvin trial continues, also in Minneapolis, same city. And to get an opinion on this, to open up the conversation, I want to turn to our guest, Carmine. Carmine, what do you think about the ongoing Derek Chauvin trial? What do you think about these protests? And what do you think we would see, whatever verdict comes out on the Chauvin trial, whether it's guilty on all counts, completely, vindicted with no charges, all charges dropped, cleared, or some mixed message between the protests that we saw last night and the ongoing Derek Chauvin trial? What do you see coming in terms of civil unrest here in the States?
It seems to me that if you give Black Lives Matter a reason to riot, they're going to riot.
So it'll either be a celebratory riot or an angry riot, but there's going to be a riot. I mean, you're dealing with an unruly sect of people who believe, because of our media and because of our Democrat politicians, that the law simply doesn't apply to them. You see it when people resist arrest. Well, I don't have to be arrested. The law doesn't apply to me. I don't want to be. Imagine if cops only arrested people who wanted to be arrested. I mean, look, first of all, the Chauvin situation, I wouldn't find him guilty of murder, not murder one, but he's guilty of something. Involuntary manslaughter at the very least. Because I don't believe that George Floyd is dead today without a knee on his back in the prone position for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. I think that you can't really make a defense for Chauvin that holds water. I think what he did was abhorrent and wrong, and he belongs in jail. The woman who shot Daunte Wright, I think, give a different story. I think, look, after 26 years of policing, if you don't know the difference between a taser and a gun, you shouldn't be policing. So she should lose her job. But you're going to have a tough time getting a conviction on that. A very tough time. People don't want to hear that, but you're going to have a very tough time getting a conviction on a mistake, because at the end of the day, whether the cops are right or wrong, okay, in some of these situations, every one of these situations starts the same way, with somebody resisting arrest, with somebody thinking that the law doesn't apply to them, that they don't have to be arrested if they don't want to be arrested, and running away.
Wait, just so I'm clear, every situation, like as 100%, every situation always is the same. Because I can point out a 12-year-old who didn't resist arrest. I can point out people who were in like Walmart and get shot, not even dealing with a real gun.
It's an infinitesimal number. It's an infinitesimal number.
I don't know that.
A microscopic number. You do know that.
I don't know that.
You know that.
A microscopic number?
There's millions of police stops, tens of millions of police stops every year. How many shootings are there?
Well, whether they're shootings or not, I mean, well, I'll put it this way. There are 1,000 killings a year by cops. And the comparison is not to the United States in and of itself, as if the United States is in a vase. The comparison is, what does it look like around the rest of the world? It's nowhere near close like that from the standpoint of the number of people cops killed each year.
The rest of the world doesn't have 300 million guns on the streets.
Well, Canada has a ton of guns on the streets. Other countries have a ton of guns. So you believe it's the gun in and of itself that's the issue?
I'm saying if you're a police officer and you pull over somebody and you realize that their outstanding warrant is on a weapons charge, and they
look, Carnan, I don't have an issue with this case. I agree with you on this one. Look, you would never get a conviction on this woman. I watched this and I said to myself, "Oh God, don't do that." From the standpoint of the resisting, that's what I said. I said, "Oh my God, he's gonna kill you if you do that."
Isn't this freaking the definition of involuntary manslaughter? Isn't that literally exactly what we're talking about, where she accidentally killed a dude? What am I missing here?
But she had no intention of doing it. That's the catch.
That's
in her head,
that's involuntary.
It is involuntary, but I know, but in capacity of her doing her job. I mean, and look, this is the way I'm looking. I'm just telling you the way I'm looking at it, and the way I think a jury is going to do it. 99%. Keep in mind, 1,000 killings a year by cops. 99% walk, no charges. And of that 99%, of the 1% that get charged, only 30% go to jail. So starting with that alone, and you're looking at this case where she's screaming, "Taser, taser, taser," and then pulls out a gun, and she says, "OS, I shot him." It got across. She had no intention of putting a bullet in him.
No, I hear you, and I want to hear Carmine on this, but that sounds to me like the definition of involuntary manslaughter, and the fact that the extremely low conviction rate for police, that seems to be almost directly a result of qualified immunity. Also culturally, but the fact that so few people, so few of the officers who do commit crimes in the course of doing their duty, I would say, don't get prosecuted for it. That is qualified immunity, if nothing else.
Well,
you see in New Mexico, you see in New York City. They've recently made changes ending qualified immunity. The ACLU is pushing for that in Minnesota. I could see that taking place later this year. Now, I don't know how that would affect the case of Kimberly Potter. if she gets charged. But Carmine, what's your take?
Well, the first thing, when you get rid of qualified immunity, you're also going to have no cops left because nobody's going to want to be a cop under those circumstances. Most times, you talk about 1,000 police shootings a year, and that sounds like a big number. But most times it's police shooting. I mean, I would like to look at the numbers and how many of those cases somebody had a weapon that they were brandishing or had fired at police. So, yeah, most of those people are not going to get charged. They were defending their lives or somebody else's. In the rare case where the cop is wrong, Tamir Rice, Lando Castillo, Walter Scott, Laquan McDonald, Elijah McClain, and I believe in the George Floyd case, police will be held responsible. There are some cases where the police are not held responsible, and they should be. Rodney King comes to mind. But there are cases where regular people are not held responsible, and they should be. O.J. Simpson comes to mind. Casey Anthony comes to mind.
What are you talking about, O.J. Simpson? O.J. Simpson went through a trial, and they found him not guilty. I mean, those things are radically different. I mean, there's a difference between a cop flagrantly abusing their authority and getting off, which is what they typically do. I'm sorry, I don't understand this idea that you believe that cops just, are being unfairly tarnished. Even if I give you that, let's say 50% of the cops that were involved in those killings or those shootings were fair kills, I don't believe for a moment that 90%, 50% or 70% were fair shoots. I don't buy that. I don't buy that at all. Because look, here's the thing. Even if the suspect runs like this, he tried to run. He tried to get away. He wasn't trying to kill anybody. He wasn't trying to shoot anybody. He tried to run. And that in and of itself would give people and say fair shoot. And I'm saying maybe that shouldn't be a fair shoot. Maybe if the suspect isn't fighting you and the suspect is trying to escape, maybe that in and of itself is not enough to kill the suspect.
I would say to you that a 2,000-pound car is a weapon.
The 2,000-pound car is a weapon if the person is trying to use it as a weapon. But if the individual is just trying to get away, that's a different. I guess that's my point. In many of these situations, you may have a person trying to get away that is not being violent towards the cop. And that's still considered fair murder or fair kill. I'm saying it shouldn't be.
And she didn't mean to shoot him. He didn't mean to shoot him, which I don't understand how you would mistake a taser for a gun because they don't even feel the same. But let's take what you're saying, okay? Now, I want to propose a different scenario to you. She doesn't shoot him. They don't stop him. He gets in that car. He does 80 trying to get away from them and hits a 10-year-old kid, kills him. She's getting blamed today for not stopping him. We have the same issue. There's still riots because a 12-year-old black kid was killed by some idiot in the car doing 80 miles an hour trying to go different police. Why didn't police stop him?
But Carmine, that also applies if she shoots him and he careens into a car, which is exactly what he did. That's exactly what he did. He careened into a car after being injured and shot. What are his chances? Are his chances of avoiding hitting somebody better if he is not shot or if he is shot?
Just so I understand you, if somebody doesn't want to be arrested and they jump back in their car, we're supposed to let them go.
Oh, and she wasn't trying to let him go. She tased him. And that's why I'm postulating that she's not wrong for tasing him. That's why, I guess that's the point. I'm being consistent in what I'm saying here. Okay. I don't take any issue with her trying to stop him from leaving. In fact, I take issue more so with him and his reaction to this. I've been consistent saying, look, he shouldn't have responded that way. But also I look at this and think to myself, in situations where it seems like the cop is trying to stop that person from leaving, or the breach of the authority in and of itself is enough for the cop to kill. And I'm saying that's not true. It shouldn't be the case.
What about and Jamarl, to your credit, you have been consistent about this. You did your monologue on it this morning. We were talking about this, and I was the one who was saying there's a case for involuntary manslaughter. Jamarl was saying he thought the reasonable thing would be to fire her, not to try to bring her up on that charge. So if anything, I'm a little bit more to the left in this way on this one. Whatever. Carmine, what do you think about the take that police shouldn't necessarily be handling traffic violations? That you should have a separate force of officers who don't carry firearms, who don't carry active, loaded, deadly weapons, but instead carry something on the level of a taser that can be used to restrain if they find somebody who has a warrant, they find somebody who's being belligerent, that kind of thing. What's your take on that?
I'm glad you asked me that question because last week a drug dealer murdered a cop who just approached his vehicle without a gun drawn. Murdered him. Yesterday in Georgia, 3 cops were shot by somebody on a traffic violation. If you bring traffic enforcement out there with no guns, you're going to have a slaughter of traffic enforcement officers. If the person coming to your car, you know they ain't got no gun, and you do, you're not going with them. If you are a violent criminal, that's the most absurd idea I've ever heard. Absurd. It's absurd. And I think if you want that, let's have a test case. Here's the test case. All the politicians calling for it, unarm your security first. Not mine. Unarm your security first. Lead by example. That's ridiculous. We would have dead cops from coast to coast. Every traffic stop is dangerous, man. Every traffic stop is dangerous. And these reforms are being proposed by people who never sat in a police car and had to do this.
All right, I hear you. I'm thinking about it. We got to go to a break. We're joined by Carmine Sabia. He's writer and editor at large at SabiaReport.com, and you can follow him on Twitter at Carmine Sabia. Watch the Carmine Sabia show by going to SabiaReport.com and subscribe to his feed on rockfin.com/Sabia Report. We're going into a break, but we'll be back with Carmine on the other side talking about immigration, Biden's immigration policies, and this new security deal late in the talks between United States, Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show by any means necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Interestingly enough, yesterday, oftentimes you guys hear me complain that the press briefings are not adversarial enough, that the entire point of an adversarial press is to ask questions that the person doesn't necessarily want to answer about things that they all things being equal, would rather hide. And one of those is on immigration, and especially for this administration. Joe Biden made a change from the Trump administration where he openly said he would accept kids coming in. Now, despite the fact that Joe Biden gets out and says, don't come to the country, please don't come to the country. The moment that you say we're going to accept the kids, logically speaking, especially if you've engaged in affairs that have damaged those countries, be it with sanctions or be it with coups or other kind of drug policy, those kids make that trip here for a better life. As such, we have a crowded border. And not just a crowded border, you have a lot of kids unaccompanied that are coming to the border that have filled up our, I don't know what you call them, cages, our camps. Of course, they've called them something now different that Joe Biden is in as a comparison to one Donald Trump. But the fact remains that there's a problem, or they can call it an immigration crisis. Biden and Psaki was asked some very difficult questions about this that Psaki didn't particularly like, especially on the deal that was apparently just made. The United States government says it's reached a border security agreement with Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala. According to the deal, the Mexican government will maintain a force of 10,000 troops, with the Guatemalan government sending 1,500 troops to the southern border, where it would set up 10 checkpoints, and the Honduran government sending 7,000 troops to this border to disperse a large contingent of migrants situated there. Now, if many of the people that are coming are children, and many of the people who are coming are taking that path for kids, what is going to be the response for basically militarizing the walk or the move from those countries to the U.S.? And is it to the detriment or to the betterment of the kids that are making that trip? Psaki didn't necessarily like this question, but I think the question is fair game. Joining us to have a conversation about the changes that are taking place regarding the Biden administration and immigration, we're joined with Carmine Sabia. He's writer and editor at large at the SabiaReport.com. Carmine, I know you've seen this, and I know you probably had a chuckle about this on a few points. Biden apparently is going to build a wall. He's going to build a wall. He's going to do that. He's going to finish that. But he's also militarizing the pathway between countries in order to prevent the migrants from coming into the country. Basically, a Trumpian move, if you're going to call it a move at all, right? So he's adopted Trump's policies within a very short time that Trump left. What do you think? I thought this was phenomenal. What are your thoughts?
Fantastic. Here's the difference. The difference is the media will celebrate this as a solution instead of, it's racist. It's racist. The wall suddenly is not racist anymore, by the way. So that's a celebration. We've unracistified the wall. Is that a word? Can we say unracistified?
Unracified. Well, it's funny. I used to always think to myself, I was like, Obama kicked 3 million Hispanics or 3 million people out of the country, but that's not racist. Trump was less, but that was. And for whatever particular reason, the non-racist deportations, despite the fact that there were more, was worse than the less racist deportations, which, with the more racist deportation. You get my point. But please, continue.
It's interesting. I love it because you are fair. I love that. You should be on national TV. But the problem is, it's you know what, dude? It's not even a problem. It's just hilarious. It's hilarious because the media really, except for at those press briefings, right? I think that reporters do their jobs. When you get to the anchors, you're not going to hear Don Lemon talking about this. Chris Cuomo is not going to be crying tonight on CNN about the horror of this. It's the same policy. Maybe even tougher, but with a different guy. Their guy's doing it. So it's okay now. Everything's cool because their guy's doing it. Listen, Trump's policies were working, and you hit the nail on the head. You could say stay home all you want, but when you say the words, we're not going to deport kids, you know what you're doing? Parents are going to send their kids alone.
Yeah, they're going to send them.
Where they might get trafficked, raped, or killed. Okay? You're putting children in danger. Don't come, but we'll take your kids.
Well, to their credit, they've been focusing on the children, but it strikes me as rank hypocrisy. This is another side of the conversation that we will frequently bring up on this show. We work to create a lot of these crises, whether it's the drug war, which has been destructive not just in the United States, but in the nations to our south, or the outright coups and overthrows of these governments over the course, pretty much every decade for, the last half century. And quite a bit more often than that, actually, where we've overthrown these governments, created perpetual political instability, long-term economic crises. But yeah, it is Jamarl is fair. He's good on this stuff, and so are you on a lot of this stuff too. Here's the thing, though. You said the reporters, in the press briefing room and on TV are doing their jobs. What did you mean by that? I believe I heard you say that correctly. Do you mean just kowtowing to Biden in the exact way that you would expect? What did you mean by that, Carmine?
No, I think they're doing their job by asking the question a lot better than you're going to see. Listen, I don't think they're doing a perfect job. Please don't misunderstand me. But I think they're doing a better job than the nighttime anchors are doing.
I guess what frustrates me is from watching the press briefings, it seems like they're willing to more or less accept the responses from Psaki verbatim. And granted, that's the nature of it. She takes a question, she answers it, and then usually there's not too much back and forth. Usually she moves on to the next reporter. Why, if there is a gap, why do you think it's there? It might be a dumb question. I can fill in my own answer. It's just because the mainstream media on the news, on TV, or online, frankly, in articles, they've already bought in. They already have their positions drawn. They have a culture, and they're keeping each other in that culture of supporting Biden against all odds, even when he imitates Trump like this. But what's your take, Carmine?
Pretty much the same. They are supporting him no matter what he does. But I think, like I said, I think that in the press briefing room, they're doing a slightly better job than at night on the primetime shows. I don't see Chris Cuomo crying anymore. I don't see, and you'll go to the celebrities. I don't see Idina Menzel talking to her son about, oh, no more kids in cages, because they're not cages anymore. Now
there's something else. Yeah. There's something else. They're no longer the material of a cage. It's plastic barrier or something like that. When ALC was at the thing crying and everything else, look, I think it's a fair point to say that we should do better in regards to our immigration system. And if we're going to say, yeah, kids are fair game to come to the country, then we need to make sure we can accommodate those kids. And these conditions are appalling, whether they're with Trump or whether we're with Biden. I think that's just an honest assessment of it, right? Why do you think that mainstream media, and this kind of gets to what Shane is saying, are they lying or are they blind, or is it a blind spot? I ask this question all the time, especially to people who are in the media on some level, because I'm curious about what's behind the veil. Like you said, in the White House press briefings, there's a certain degree of bias. But yesterday, Jen Psaki was very annoyed by the person who kept asking her these very specific questions and asking her in a way that I approve. Meaning, she's asking Jen a question in a way that is uncomfortable, because it gets across to something. If I'm saying, hey, you seem to be militarizing the walk from these places, and is it safe for the child to do that if indeed you're going to accept the kids? Well, she hated that question. She didn't like the framing of it. She didn't like how it was being asked. She even has to stop and say, well, we don't characterize it as militarizing. We characterize it as putting police forces all across the way. You're militarizing the border, and you're militarizing the walk. You're trying to stem the tide of kids coming here. Like, that's basically what you're trying to do, and you're trying to use the military and the various governments to do it. You just don't want to say that. So, no, I know what you're talking about. Yesterday, Jen did not have a good time answering questions like this. When it gets to mainstream media, though, like the CNNs of the world or the MSNBCs of the world, do you think it is already baked in? Like, do you think it's a lie, meaning they know they're not telling the truth, and they still get that story? Or is it just a radical blind spot?
No. Oh, no, it's not a blind spot. They know what they're doing. They're running interference. They know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing, bro. They I don't believe for one microsecond that they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
They are running interference because they have a preferred party. They have a preferred party, and that's who they're concerned about promoting. So, no, it's not a blind spot at all. It's not a blind spot at all. It's very.
See, I think you might be a little bit more pessimistic than I am in this one. I think I'd say there is a blind spot. I'd say that culturally they're so bought into this BS that they just go along with it in the same way. I'm sure there are some people who knew the truth on Russiagate, on a lot of the BS that was spreading about that. But nevertheless, the vast majority just kind of went along with it because most journalists are lazy and do the bare minimum in terms of fundamental research, and are usually regurgitating source reporting that they find from other people. Because again, after all, that is the easiest thing to do. You just pick up what other people are saying, you reframe it slightly, and you put it down in your own variant of it. I want to turn very slightly. We've only got a minute left in this segment. Trump has been talking about this. If he were on Twitter, I'm sure he would be talking about Biden on immigration constantly, every day, and probably getting a lot of likes and retweets too for this stuff, because after all, it is Biden aping Trump. I would say in a weird way, the Republicans, even though they might be gratified to see Biden responding in this way after criticizing him for sort of tacitly calling folks up to the border and not responding quite strongly enough in their eyes early on, they're going to paint this, and I'm imagining Trump would paint this too in the coming years as he tries to run for president again in 2024. We'll paint this as Biden criticizing Trump constantly while nevertheless following suit and doing more or less what Trump would have done. What's your take, Carmine?
About what Trump would be doing?
And about the Republican response generally. How do you think Republicans are going to use this in the coming years for the midterms and in 2024?
Oh God, I mean, they're going to say Trump was right all along because he was. Obviously, he was. I think Trump can use this in 2024. If he decides to run, it'd be like, Biden reversed all my policies, and then weeks later started bringing them back.
That's effectively what he's done. And I mean, I don't mean to throw you crazy softball questions like that, but there are only so many ways I can look at this. And we hadn't brought Trump into this other than mentioning, how Biden is doing effectively what he would have done. And I have seen Trump talking about this wherever you see him, although he's not on social media anymore. We've got to go. Carmine, thank you for joining us this morning.
Awesome to be here. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for talking with us. That was Carmine Sabia, writer and editor at large at SabiaReport.com. You can follow him on Twitter at Carmine Sabia. Watch the Carmine Sabia show on SabiaReport.com and subscribe to his feed on rockfin.com/SabiaReport. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. When we come back, we are taking your calls in the rap segment for today's show, 202-521-1320. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are now in our rap segment for today's show, the last segment of this morning on Fault Lines, which means we're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Our lines are now open and available for communication. Quick note for folks who are listening. We air every morning in D.C. on the radio on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also on in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. And if you like our show, please, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, do give us a like, share this if it's a video or audio. And again, if you want to join the conversation right now, is the best chance, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, on the back end, I heard you, and you brought this up briefly on the radio show too, the idea that there's other stuff behind the cancellation, that pause that the FDA and the CDC are calling for of the delivery of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. What have you seen? I mean, I'm guessing you were saying that based on something. What have you been watching on that?
I mean, I guess my thought is, because I agree with you, it's a big deal. I'm uncertain. Two things could take place, right? It could be that a weird oddity between Europe, between the UK and the EU, created this kind of anomalous back and forth on the blood clot issue that starts to get more traction. And in the context of that traction, and with the drug mRNA, which on some level is still experimental, and these guys are looking for any kind of side effect, Johnson & Johnson could have somebody who bring up blood clots. And Johnson & Johnson could look at Europe and say, okay, well, we need to deal with this in the same way that they were dealing with this in Europe. Meaning, it could be very well that they see something in Europe that started off in this kind of weird political curmudgeon of sorts, curmudgeon-y-ish issue, if that's a word, and finds its way to propagate here just because of something that may come up here. So, meaning, they see something in the UK, the UK is using a different reason for it initially, or Europe is using a different reason for it, but they see something similar here for blood clot, and it takes on a wider proportion than what it would typically take place if Europe didn't exist. Meaning, if the AstraZeneca thing didn't exist at all, would Johnson & Johnson be bringing this up as an issue? And that, I don't know. And because I don't know that, otherwise, is there something else that these guys just know that we don't. Because 6 out of, 6 million seems, that just doesn't seem as a sufficient justification to bring a pause on something like this. I'm just wondering if there's something else. And, I have heard other people, let's say like the Naomi Wolfs of the world, I was contacting her earlier, see if she would come on to the show, who have been taking issue with this, who've been saying that, look, there are issues with this that are not necessarily being discussed. And the moment that you bring up an issue, they shut you down, that type of thing. And so now she's like, look, I told you I wasn't a conspiracy theorist. I told you that there were concerns. These concerns go beyond just 6 blood clots. So I am trying to get somebody on to have a conversation because all things being equal, my default position is basically yours. I don't get how 6 is a justification to put a pause on something when you've had 560,000 people to drop dead in the U.S. That's where I'm in. So it's not so much that I've seen evidence to the contrary. It's more so I'm giving, at the very least, the capability of somebody who has a different opinion than us to come on and just make their case and explain it. Does that make sense? I'm trying to be fair to the other side of this to try to understand why they're putting a pause on this. And is that pause as ludicrous as it looks, or is there something else to it? That's what I want to know. Because the 6 looks ridiculous. Pausing this for 6 looks absurd.
It does. And we're hosting the show. There's only so much time. I've been trying to read around and see how different outlets are covering this. I don't think they're doing a good job of playing up and talking about exactly how ridiculous that seems. If there are 6 cases out of 6.8 million people, that's a less than a 1 in 1.1 million chance of developing this. Even if there were 100 cases, that would be significantly higher. If there are 500 cases, that would be significantly higher. That's still less than a 1 in 10,000 chance. That would put it into the sort of lowest possible category of symptom, which is that it's a very rare side effect. And that would be a lot more significant, clearly, almost 100 times more likely if there were 500 cases that you would develop it than with this. But 6, it does make me think that there's an ulterior motive going on, whether it's political, whether there's something on the back end that they don't like about Johnson & Johnson, whether it has to do with the fact that Johnson & Johnson had already slowed down after the Emergent Biosolutions plant failure over in Baltimore last week, whether it's, like you're saying, some underlying other set of facts that they're looking at that we don't have access to. It's a weird decision to be coming out, and it's all over the news this morning. We've got calls, and we're taking more. 202-521-1320 is the number. Let's go to Will calling in from Chicago. Will, what's on your mind?
Hey, guys. With the last guest, I just wanted to remind your audience that the law is not something that just should be followed. And also, it only applies to us if we get caught doing a certain crime and if they can get the police in good shape enough to catch us. So I just want to remind your viewers that. Thank you. Also, one more thing. The point that the guy had about it being a small, microscopic chance that a police would kill somebody. There's infinite, potential inside of a 13-year-old boy. That could be the next Einstein. So I just wanted to just rant about that guy. So that guy was annoying.
Yeah, Carmine, here's a particular view of that. And like I told him, I don't know that at all because I don't think that's true. It's cops kill 1,000 people a year. And unless you believe that they are perfect in their assessment of who gets killed, which is ludicrous to even go with postulate that. Even if they get it wrong 40%, that's monstrous. That's monstrous. And it doesn't even, making the point to them that cops kill 1,000 people a year here, that doesn't count anywhere else in the world. Nowhere else has that outside of a war zone. And, using it and putting it on the guns. Okay, let's have this conversation. If you honestly believe that the issue is the guns, then we should be passing legislation on guns, which, of course, he immediately was like, oh, wait, I didn't realize what I just said here, and pulled it away to something else. Look, one of the things that we need to keep in mind, we all have bad days at our job. There are going to be bad days at our job. So when somebody doesn't come onto my show, I have to deal with that. If there's a screw up in regards to Google changing the way that they cut videos, I have to deal with that. We have to deal with that. Those are things that happen that make our job difficult. The same thing is true for cops. The same thing will be true for a highway sweeper. Anybody in the capacity of their job has difficult times. A doctor may have some anomaly that shows up in a surgery, but the doctor is expected to have a basic modicum of common sense or basic modicum of skill when they're dealing with and negotiating those difficulties. And the fact that the difficulty presents itself is not in and of itself of a reason or justification for failure. That cop failed that day. It was a level of incompetence. And just because a person decided to run from a cop, that in and of itself shouldn't be a death warrant. Full stop. Everybody has to deal with things that are difficult, including cops. And just because they have to deal with something that's difficult, oh, this person is talking back to me. How dare this 12-year-old say something back to me in this way and challenging my authority? I could show you hundreds of videos where cops are doing things that are flagrantly malicious and flagrantly horrific. My basic point is this. Just because you give a cop a hard time does not give that cop license to kill you. Full stop. Nor should society expect or accept something like that. All of us have bad days at the office, and all of us have to negotiate those bad days. Go for it.
I'll be honest. I don't think American society does expect or accept that. I think that
it does.
If you look at it pretty much in every case, and I agree with it, in a lot of these cases, it gets misportrayed. But it's not like people are like, well, that person insulted the cop, therefore they should have been murdered. I've never heard anybody say that.
Are you serious? Have you seen the right-wing sites that basically justify pretty much anything that happens? The right wing justifies the killing of those people. It does. I can't believe you even saying that. They oftentimes make this excuse that the moment that somebody breaches the cop's authority, that it's perfectly okay to kill that person. They often find ways to just make it seem as if it's okay to kill that guy. They do it all the time. They whitewash the murders.
They do, but that's not what you were saying, and I was responding to what you were saying. You were saying that we live in a society where any pushback, even if it's just verbal flack, even if it's just an insult or a dirty look, is seen in American society. It's accepted. We're acculturated to the idea that that's justification for that person being killed. I have literally never heard seen a single person make that specific claim. I have heard what you described, which is people on the right and just across the spectrum justifying the use of police force in ways that I wouldn't accept. So, for instance, just because somebody's resisting arrest doesn't mean they deserve to die.
Okay, I'm missing the difference between those two conversations. It's like I'm missing the difference between the thing you're saying. All right, I've never seen the situation that you presented, and then you turn around and replicate the position that I presented.
Because that's not an insult. Because that is a far
challenge of
greater
authority
level of response. It's not just a challenge of authority. It's trying to actively resist arrest. If I flip a cop off, does that mean that I deserve to die? I would say that very, very, very few people think yeah. If I flipped a cop off and that was the pretext for me getting shot by a cop, my hands are in the air. They're not reaching for my pocket where a gun could be located. I haven't seen anybody say, okay, well, that means that person deserved to die. I have heard people make claims, again, if a person is resisting arrest, which is different from an insult. I don't know how you can't. Those are not at all the same thing. And I don't
because oftentimes what you have is any little resistance is enough for that cop to say you're resisting arrest. That's the point that I'm trying to make. You flipping a cop off could be cut. In fact, you have situations where they would say the person was resisting arrest, and there's no primary charge. That's not even a primary charge. Like, resisting arrest indicates that the individual was about to be arrested for something, and oftentimes they would use resisting of arrest as the charge in and of itself. How do you think that happens?
To be clear,
the guy that's riding the bicycle and flips the cop off, and the cops take the guy down and going to drag the guy to jail.
In the case that we're talking about, and to be extremely clear, this person, Daunte Wright, did not deserve to die, but they tried to get in their car and drive away. That is actively resisting arrest.
Oh, I'm not talking about Daunte. I was talking about just in general in the case of
force is not proportional here. I get you here, I get you, Jamarl, but you said one thing and then I kind of had to walk it back. Resisting arrest is a different thing. And yes, I agree. If somebody's insulting a cop or flipping a cop off, that should not be taken as them resisting arrest. And when it is, it doesn't qualify in my book. But we're talking different things here. We've got to close the show out, though.
Yeah, we're talking different things. I disagree with you on this one. It happens all the time. But right. Go for it.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to thank all of our guests, all of our callers, and you. Oh, and Jamarl Thomas, my co-host, and Andre, our engineer, but also, most importantly, you for listening to today's show. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, signing off.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. I'm going to have to cut this early because we have another interview coming up in like 2 hours. Nick Pope is going to be on the show. Nick Pope is the UK Ministry of Defence, at least he used to be. He is basically the British version of Agent Mulder from the X-Files. He had been in the British government for God knows how long. And for a while, in his capacity of the government, he was studying the Weird Desk. He was the guy who was supposed to run down the various things that happened to make the determination about whether or not this is legit, we can figure out what this is, or in 5% of the cases, we have no idea what this is. Nick Pope came out early on about this, and he's been one of the few people who was willing to put his neck on the line before all of this stuff started in the media. Meaning it's one thing to say this stuff in the last 3 years where the world has changed. It's another thing to kind of have these conversations and these arguments before the world changed. Well, Pope was out there before the world changed. And so he's going to come on the show. He's going to have a conversation. This should be another really good interview. If you guys are interested at all on credible and real, legitimate UFO information that on some level can be validated, well, Fault Lines, my show, is one of the networks or one of the places where you can get that information from. And we often dig into the nuance. We often ask this stuff more in political ways just because that's the typical show. And we don't look at this stuff entirely in the way that some of the UFO shows look at it. That said, this should be a really good interview. And, you know, Pope is going to probably talk about the Rendlesham Forest event. That was something he was in part writing the book on. Some of the stuff I want to get into are the UFO files from Russia, because Russia apparently opened their own books. And what kind of like with Lou in regards to how is the stuff constructed in the UK? And on some level, are there cooperations between the UK and the various states on this issue? Now, it should be a really, really good interview. If you guys, like I said, are interested at all in how governments work and how governments have been dealing with this issue, 12 o'clock, 2 hours, Nick Pope will be right here on the soapbox. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say subscribe, and I'm going to say share. Thanks all. I'll see y'all in a few. Bye-bye.